There are streets that know their own ghosts, and Barrow Lane was one of them. Alex had walked its length 100 times, a familiar shortcut between the bustling high street and his quiet flat. But tonight, the lane felt different. The air, usually thick with the distant hum of London, was preternaturally still, and the amber glow of the streetlights seemed to pool on the pavement in viscous, isolated puddles, leaving deep trenches of shadow between them. It was in the third pool of light that the first flicker of wrongness ignited in his mind. He passed the same red brick wall with the same spray-painted tag of a stylized fox. He had noticed it on his last pass, admiring its clean lines. Now, seeing it again, an identical fox in an identical stance, a cold trickle of unease began its slow descent down his spine. He quickened his pace, his trainers making soft, rhythmic taps against the wet cobbles. The sound was too loud in the silence. Up ahead, the iconic red dome of a phone box emerged from the gloom, a relic from another time. He'd passed it minutes ago, he was sure of it. Yet here it was again, occupying the exact same curve in the road, its windows dark and smeared with grime. His breath hitched. He forced himself to keep walking, his eyes locked on the phone box as if it were a fixed point in a shifting world. As he drew level, a movement from within snagged his attention. A figure, blurred and indistinct, stood with its back to the glass. It was little more than a smudge of pale color against the darkness, a human-shaped distortion in the air. Alex's feet stopped of their own accord. He stared, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The figure did not move, but the very air around the phone box seemed to thicken, to grow heavy with a watchful presence. He tore his gaze away and forced his legs to move, striding past with a renewed, desperate urgency. The lane stretched onward, a seemingly endless tunnel of Victorian terraces and high garden walls. He focused on a distinctive blue door with a brass lion's head knocker, using it as a landmark. He passed it, counted his steps, and rounded at a gentle bend. And there it was, the same blue door, the same lion's head knocker, gleaming dully under the next streetlight. A wave of vertigo washed over him, so potent he had to press a hand against the cold, damp brick of a garden wall to steady himself. He was trapped. The lane was a loop, a perfect seamless circle from which there was no exit. Panic, cold and sharp, began to crystallize in his chest. He pushed off the wall and broke into a run, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The familiar sights flew past in a nauseating carousel: the fox graffiti, the broken street lamp that had always been broken, the overgrown privet hedge that spilled onto the pavement, and then the phone box. It materialized from the shadows once more, a crimson sentinel in the endless night. This time he could not look away. The blurry figure was still there, a little clearer now, a little more defined. He could make out the suggestion of a shoulder, the shape of a head. It was no longer facing away. It was turned, just slightly, as if aware of his presence, as if it had been waiting for him to complete another circuit. The growing unease blossomed into full-blown dread, coiling in his gut like a serpent. He was not just lost, he was being watched. He was part of a cycle he did not understand, a player in a ghostly game whose rules were written in the very stones of Barrow Lane. The figure in the phone box began to clarify, its form pulling into sharp, chilling focus. It was a woman, her skin possessing the stark, waxy pallor of something long removed from the sun. She wore clothing from another era, a high-collared dress of faded navy, its fabric looking stiff and formal. Her hair was pinned in a severe, old-fashioned style, dark strands framing a face that was both gaunt and unnervingly placid. Her eyes, wide and unblinking, were the color of tarnished silver, and they were fixed directly on him. A primal part of Alex's brain screamed at him to run, to break the cycle and never look back, but a morbid, paralyzing curiosity rooted him to the spot. He took a single, hesitant step forward, his own reflection a ghostly echo on the phone box's dirty glass. The woman did not move, yet her presence seemed to swell, filling the small cubicle, pressing against the windows. The air grew colder, carrying the faint, metallic scent of old coins and damp earth. Then, with a slow, deliberate grace that was more terrifying than any sudden movement, she turned her head. Her neck made no sound, but Alex imagined the dry creak of ancient hinges. Her silvered eyes tracked his every tremor. One pale hand, fingers long and slender, lifted from her side and pressed against the inside of the glass. The pain fogged slightly around her palm. The other hand rose, and with an eerie, weightless motion, she reached for the door. The click of the latch was deafening in the profound silence. The heavy red door swung outward, groaning on its hinges. A wave of frigid air washed over Alex, carrying with it the profound sorrow of decades. The woman stepped out, her feet making no sound on the wet cobbles. Her arm extended, that pale hand reaching for him, fingers curling slightly in a gesture that was neither threatening nor welcoming, but simply inevitable. It was a summons, an invitation to join her in the endless loop. That single outstretched hand shattered the last of his frozen disbelief. A raw, animal sound tore from his throat. He spun on his heel, his body flooding with a surge of pure adrenaline. He did not run back the way he had come, knowing that path led only to the fox graffiti and the blue door and back to her. Instead, he launched himself blindly across the road, toward the high, unbroken wall that bordered the lane. His mind, scrabbling for any escape, latched onto a single desperate theory, that the loop was a trick of perception, a path one had to physically break. He scrambled over the wall, his fingers scraping against rough stone, his jacket snagging and tearing. He landed hard in a sunken, overgrown garden on the other side, the impact jarring his bones. Without a backward glance, he thrashed through a tangle of brambles and weeds, bursting out onto a narrow, unfamiliar service road. The air felt different here, warmer, carrying the distant, blessed sound of a car engine. He ran, his lungs burning, not caring about direction, only caring about putting as much distance as possible between himself and the crimson phone box and the woman in the vintage dress. He did not stop running until he stumbled out onto the bright, noisy, wonderfully ordinary high street. He leaned against a lamppost, chest heaving, his body trembling with spent terror. People brushed past him, their conversations a comforting, mundane hum. He looked back down the mouth of Barrow Lane, now just a dark slit between two buildings. It looked innocuous, just another quiet London side street. But he knew the truth that lay coiled within its looping length. He knew the pale woman was still there, waiting in her glass and metal cage, forever reaching for someone to share her circuit. Alex turned his back on the lane, a silent, fervent vow etching itself into his soul. He would never, ever walk down Barrow Lane again. There is a unique kind of loneliness that settles over a driver on a long, dark road, a sense of being the only soul for miles, sealed in a bubble of glass and steel. For John, that loneliness curdled into something else entirely on Crawley Road. The late shift at the distribution centre had bled the colour from his day, leaving him with the grainy fatigue that only a midnight drive through the Manchester outskirts could deepen. His headlights carved two frail tunnels through the damp gloom, illuminating the endless procession of identical semi-detached houses, their windows dark, their gardens sleeping. The only sound was the steady thrum of his own engine and the rhythmic swish of his wipers clearing a fine, persistent mist from the windshield. It was the rhythm that first snagged his attention, a new sound threading itself into the familiar automotive symphony. A sharp, distinct tap, then another. It wasn't the engine, nor the wipers. It was too crisp, too organic. He adjusted his grip on the steering wheel, his eyes flicking to the dark pavement sliding past. They were empty. He dismissed it as a loose piece of trim or a stone caught in the tire tread, a common enough occurrence. He accelerated slightly, the engine note rising to a gentle growl. The tapping kept pace. A cold knot tightened in John's stomach. He slowed, easing his foot off the accelerator, listening intently. The tapping slowed in perfect, unnerving synchronization. It was the sound of footsteps, hard-soled shoes striking wet asphalt with a metronomic precision that matched his speed exactly. He stared out at the empty passenger seat, then at the vacant pavement, his mind struggling to reconcile the auditory evidence with the visual void. There was no one there. No jogger, no late-night walker, no one. Ahead, a string of sodium streetlights cast their sickly orange glow. As his car approached the first one, the light flickered violently, buzzed like a dying insect, and died, plunging that section of the road into profound blackness. He drove through the newly created pool of shadow, his own headlights seeming feeble and ineffectual. The next light did the same, flickering and extinguishing just as he reached it, as if his very presence were a contagion killing the illumination. The footsteps, meanwhile, continued their relentless, synchronized tattoo just outside his door. His heart began to beat a frantic counter-rhythm to the steps. He gripped the wheel until his knuckles ached white, his eyes darting from the dying lights ahead to his rearview mirror. The road behind was a tunnel of receding darkness, the streetlights he had already passed still glowing normally. For a moment, there was only the empty black ribbon of asphalt. Then, movement. A shadow, deeper than the surrounding night, detached itself from the gloom. It was a humanoid shape, tall and impossibly thin, a mere silhouette of concentrated darkness that strode down the center of the road with a fluid, unnatural gait. Its legs moved in time with the tapping. It was keeping pace with him, a phantom pedestrian stalking his car from behind. A jolt of pure, undiluted fear shot through him. He slammed his foot on the accelerator. The engine roared in protest, the car surging forward. The footsteps outside instantly matched the new, frantic tempo, becoming a rapid staccato drumbeat against the road. He glanced in the mirror again. The figure was closer now, its form seeming to drink the light around it, its featureless head angled directly at his vehicle. The streetlights ahead continued their macabre dance, winking out one by one, creating a runway of darkness that he was desperately speeding down, pursued by a silence that walked with the sound of footsteps. The world outside John's car dissolved into a frantic, light-devouring tunnel. Each streetlight died just before he reached it, the darkness swallowing the road whole, only to spit it back out in his trembling high beams for a few precious seconds. The staccato rhythm of the footsteps was a deafening counterpoint to the roar of his engine, a percussive hammering against the asphalt that seemed to come from just beside his door. He risked another glance in the rearview mirror. The shadowy figure was no longer a distant silhouette, but a looming presence, its elongated form gliding over the road with impossible speed, its featureless face a void that seemed to pull at the very fabric of the night. Panic seized him, a cold, sharp-toothed thing that gnawed at his reason. His breath hitched in his throat, fogging the inside of the windshield. He fumbled for the heater, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. It was in that moment of fractured attention that the tapping changed. The synchronized footsteps ceased their rhythmic assault on the road and transferred to the car itself. A single sharp tap. It was not on the roof or the bonnet. It was on the glass of his driver's side window, right next to his ear. John flinched so violently the car swerved, tires screeching against the wet tarmac. His head snapped to the left. Pressed against the glass was a hand. It was not a shadow, but a thing of substance, pale, long-fingered, and waxy, like a mannequin's limb dipped in wax. There were no discernible nails, no wrinkles, just a smooth, seamless surface that ended in blunt tips. It tapped once more, a polite, almost inquisitive sound that was 1,000 times more terrifying than any frantic pounding. Behind the hand, the darkness congealed into the shape of a torso, a neck, that same blank, featureless head, leaning in close as if to peer inside his mobile prison. A raw, guttural scream tore from John's throat, swallowed by the car's interior. Instinct, primal and overwhelming, took over. He jammed his foot to the floor, flattening the accelerator. The engine screamed in protest, the car lurching forward with a surge of violent power that pressed him back into his seat. The world outside became a smear of dying light and encroaching blackness. He didn't dare look in the mirror or to his side. He focused only on the fragment of road his headlights could claim, his hands locked in a death grip on the steering wheel. For 100 yards, 200, he drove like a man possessed, the speedometer needle climbing into a territory he would never normally dare. The frantic tapping did not return. The synchronized footsteps did not resume. Gradually, as the last of the Crawley Road streetlights fell behind him and he sped onto the brighter, more trafficked ring road, the oppressive silence in the car began to register. He chanced a look in the rearview mirror. The road behind was empty, just a normal rain-slicked street receding into the distance. He glanced at his side window. There was no pale hand, no watching void. Only his own pale, terrified reflection stared back. He drove for another 20 minutes on autopilot, his body trembling with the aftershocks of adrenaline. He did not slow down until he was pulling into his own driveway, the familiar sight of his home doing little to soothe the deep, cold dread that had taken root in his bones. For weeks afterward, the memory of that synchronized stalker haunted him. He took lengthy, convoluted detours to avoid even the vicinity of Crawley Road, adding an extra half-hour to his commute without a second thought. The sound of his own footsteps on wet pavement was enough to make his heart stutter, and every time a streetlight flickered, a cold hand seemed to clench around his spine. The road, he knew, was still there, waiting in the Manchester dark, its lights poised to die for the next lone driver, its silent walker ready to fall into step once more. There are warnings that slip through the static of the everyday world, brief and crackling messages from the other side of a veil most never notice. For Sarah and Mark, driving home through the affluent, hedge-lined curves of Elm Avenue in Bristol, the warning came on a wave of radio interference. They were laughing, the comfortable, tired laughter that follows a good meal with friends, the car's interior warm and smelling faintly of wine and rain. The local radio station was playing a soft rock classic, the guitar solo weaving through their conversation, when the music dissolved into a violent hiss of white noise. Sarah reached for the dial, her fingers hovering as a voice cut through the static. It was a dry, rasping whisper devoid of gender or emotion, the words clawing their way out of the speakers. "Get out now." The message was stark, absolute. Then suddenly as it had arrived, it was gone, replaced by the smooth, inane chatter of the late-night DJ. Mark chuckled, a low, dismissive sound. Bloody pirates. Or some idiot with a CB radio playing a prank. He shook his head, his eyes never leaving the winding road ahead, the high, manicured hedges of Elm Avenue forming a deep green wall on either side. Sarah, however, felt a sliver of ice slide down her spine. The voice had not sounded like a prank. It had carried a weight, a dreadful certainty that lingered in the air long after the static had faded. She wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly feeling the chill of the night. "That was odd," she murmured, her gaze drifting to the passenger window. The hedges here were famous, towering, meticulously sculpted affairs that guarded the privacy of sprawling Victorian villas. In the sweep of the headlights, they were a shifting tapestry of light and shadow, dense and impenetrable. It was in one of these deep shadows that she saw the movement. A quick, furtive rustle, low to the ground, as if a large dog had just darted through the base of the foliage. She leaned forward, peering into the darkness. "Did you see that?" "See what?" Mark asked, his tone still light, unconcerned. "In the hedge. Something moved." He slowed the car slightly, squinting into the beams. "Probably a fox. Or a cat. This place is crawling with them." But he didn't sound entirely convinced. The rustling had been too pronounced, the movement suggesting a bulkier presence than a typical urban animal. They drove on in silence for another 50 yards. Then it happened again, this time on Mark's side. A distinct shuddering agitation ran through a section of hedge ahead, the leaves quivering as something passed through them from within. It wasn't the wind, the night was perfectly still. This was a purposeful, hidden transit. Mark's foot eased off the accelerator, the car slowing to a crawl. His earlier nonchalance had evaporated, replaced by a taut, watchful tension. The radio, now silent, seemed to have left a vacuum in the car, a space where the memory of that whispered warning echoed. "That was no fox," he said quietly, his eyes fixed on the spot where the leaves still trembled. A deep, primal curiosity, the kind that overrides better judgment, had taken hold of him. The rational part of his mind was at war with an instinct older than reason, the need to see, to confirm, to face the unknown. With a decisive motion, he pulled the car over to the curb, the tires crunching on the gravelly verge. The engine idled, a low, nervous hum. The headlights illuminated a short stretch of pavement and the dark, leafy face of the hedge, which now seemed less like a boundary and more like a living, watchful entity. "What are you doing?" Sarah asked, her voice tight with alarm. "I'm just going to have a quick look," Mark said, his hand already on the door handle. "It's probably nothing, but I have to know." He pushed the door open, stepping out into the cool night air, leaving Sarah alone in the car with her mounting dread, the silent radio, and the unsettling sensation that the hedges of Elm Avenue were holding their breath. Mark's footsteps were unnaturally loud on the quiet pavement, each crunch of gravel a small explosion in the tense stillness. He moved toward the section of hedge that had shivered moments before, his shadow stretching long and distorted ahead of him in the car's headlights. Sarah watched from the passenger seat, her knuckles white where they gripped the edge of her seat. The hedge was a wall of secrets, its dense foliage a perfect hiding place for anything, or anything. Mark paused a few feet away, leaning forward slightly, his body a silhouette of cautious intent as he peered into the labyrinth of leaves and twigs. Inside the car, the silence was shattered. The radio blared to life at a deafening volume, no longer a whisper but a raw, guttural shriek that tore through the small space. Too late, the voice was a chorus of rustling leaves and cracking branches given sentience, a sound that was fundamentally horribly wrong. Sarah screamed, a short, sharp cry lost in the radio's violent static. Outside, Mark flinched and spun toward the car, his face a mask of confusion and sudden fear. It was then that the hedge directly in front of him erupted, not with an animal's frantic scramble, but with a slow, deliberate, and utterly grotesque unfolding. The tightly woven branches at the base parted like a curtain, and something crawled out onto the pavement. It was a creature of nightmare, a blasphemous fusion of man and vegetation. Its limbs were long, knotted twigs covered in a bark-like skin that was slick with a dark, sap-like fluid. Its torso was a compressed tangle of roots and earth, and where a face should have been was a hollow, puckered orifice surrounded by writhing vine-like tendrils. It moved on all fours with a horrible clicking grace, the sound of old bones and snapping twigs. For a frozen second, Mark and the creature were locked in a tableau of mutual discovery. The thing's hollow face seemed to regard him, a wave of palpable malevolence rolling off its form. Then, with a speed that belied its awkward construction, it scuttled forward, its twig-like fingers scraping against the pavement with a sound like knives on stone. Mark's paralysis broke. He stumbled backward, his legs feeling like water, then turned and lunged for the car. He wrenched the door open and fell into the driver's seat, his breath coming in ragged, panicked gasps. "Go, go, go!" he yelled, fumbling for the gear stick. Sarah didn't need telling twice. Her hand shot out, slamming the car into drive before Mark's door was even fully closed. She stomped on the accelerator. The tires screeched, spitting gravel, and the car surged forward with a lurch that slammed Mark's door shut. In the headlights, the creature was already giving chase, a skittering, multi-limbed horror keeping pace with. For a terrifying few seconds, it moved, with an insectile certainty, its form a blur of darkness and unnatural motion just at the edge of the light. Then, as the car gained speed, it simply melted away. One moment it was there, a monstrous silhouette against the green wall, and the next it was gone, absorbed back into the hedge from which it had come without a trace. They did not slow down until they were miles away, parked under the bright, sterile lights of a 24-hour supermarket car park. The car was filled with the sound of their harsh, trembling breaths. They reported it to the police with frantic, overlapping sentences, but the officer on the other end of the phone was politely dismissive. An animal, he suggested, perhaps a badger, seen in a panic. The radio interference was written off as a coincidence. They were offered no report number, no follow-up, just a placating tone that made them feel foolish and utterly, terrifyingly alone. The official world had no box to tick for the thing that crawled out of the hedge on Elm Avenue. They drove home in a profound and shaken silence. The image of the crawler seared into their minds, and the knowledge that some warnings, once ignored, come crawling into the light. There is a particular brand of silence that belongs only to empty houses, a dense, watchful quiet that seems to swallow sound and light whole. Tom, a postman on the Derby Street route in Glasgow for the better part of a decade, knew these silences intimately. He knew which houses were occupied by shift workers, which were holiday homes, and which had been vacant for so long that their very brickwork seemed to exhale dust and neglect. Number 24 was one of the latter. A grim, soot-stained Victorian terrace with a perpetually peeling blue door and windows so grimy they looked like cataract-clouded eyes. Its garden was a tangle of skeletal weeds, and its gate hung from a single rusted hinge. Tom hadn't delivered a letter to number 24 in all his years on the job. The slot in the door was choked with dead leaves and spiderwebs. It was on a damp, grey Tuesday, the kind where the sky seems to press down on the city like a leaden lid, that the silence of number 24 was broken. Tom was halfway through his round, his bag lighter, his rhythm steady. He was about to pass the house when a flicker of movement in an upstairs window caught his eye. He stopped, his hand pausing over the bundle of mail for number 26. He looked up. The window was the one to the left of the door, a large bay window on the first floor. The grime on the glass was a permanent fixture, but behind it, standing in the deep shadows of the room, was an old woman. She was slight, stooped with age, her posture a permanent curve. A floral-patterned housecoat, faded to indistinct pastels, hung from her narrow shoulders. Her hair was a wispy cloud of white, and her face was a delicate web of fine lines. She stood perfectly still, her hands clasped in front of her, staring out at the street with a vacant, unfocused gaze. Tom felt a jolt of surprise, quickly followed by a ripple of unease. He'd have sworn on his pension the place was derelict. He'd checked the official vacant property list just last month. Number 24 was on it. He shook his head, a wry smile touching his lips. Must be a new tenant, he reasoned, or a relative house-sitting. The property companies that managed these old places were notoriously slow to update their records. He gave a small, professional nod in the direction of the window, a silent postman's greeting, and continued on his way, delivering the mail to number 26 and moving further down the street. The image of the old woman, however, lingered in his mind. There was something about her stillness, the way she seemed to be a part of the room's shadows, that felt off. An hour later, his round was nearly done. He turned onto the final stretch of Derby Street, the end of his shift a welcome thought. His route took him past number 17, another known empty. It was a mirror of number 24, though its neglect was younger, its paint less blistered. As he approached, his eyes, almost of their own volition, flicked up to its front window. And there she was, the same old woman, the same faded housecoat, the same stooped posture and wispy white hair. She was standing in the exact same pose, her hands clasped, her vacant eyes staring out from the darkness of a different empty house. Tom stopped dead in the middle of the pavement, the weight of his bag suddenly immense. A cold dread, entirely different from the day's chill, seeped into his bones. This was impossible. He looked from number 17 back in the direction of number 24, the distance between them a good 300 yards. There was no way she could have moved that fast, no reason for her to be in two separate abandoned houses. The rational explanations he'd clung to moments before crumbled to dust. The woman in the window was not a new tenant. She was not a relative. She was something else, a recurring fixture in the empty spaces of Derby Street, and the sight of her, repeated and inexplicable, left Tom feeling profoundly and unsettlingly alone on the familiar pavement. The compulsion to understand, to shatter the eerie impossibility of the woman's presence, was a physical pull in Tom's chest, stronger than the instinct to flee. The rational part of his mind, the part that sorted mail into neat, logical piles, screamed that this was a trespass, a violation of both property and sanity. But the deeper, more primal part needed to see the emptiness for itself, to prove that the dust and decay held no living tenant. His feet carried him back down Derby Street, his postal bag forgotten on his shoulder, his focus narrowed to the peeling blue door of number 24. The gate groaned in protest as he pushed it open, the sound unnaturally loud in the hushed street. Weeds clutched at his trousers as he walked the short path, their damp touch feeling like pleading. Fingers. He tried the brass knob, its surface green with verdigris. It was locked, solid and unmoving. Stepping back, he cupped his hands around his eyes and pressed his face against the grimy glass of the front window. The interior was a museum of neglect. A fine grey dust lay over everything like a shroud, coating a forgotten side table and the skeletal remains of a hat stand. Cobwebs hung in thick, sagging veils from the cornices, swaying gently in some unfelt draught. The air in the room was absolutely still, thick with the smell of damp plaster and long-decayed wood. There was no furniture beyond these few relics, no sign of life, no footprints in the dust on the floor. It was exactly as it should have been, utterly, completely abandoned. His eyes adjusted to the gloom, scanning the far wall, the base of the stairs visible through a doorway, and then he saw it. On the inside of the window pane itself, directly at his eye level, was a patch that was cleaner than the rest. It was not a smudge or a wipe, but a perfect ghostly impression. The shape of a slight, stooped figure, the faint suggestion of a floral pattern, the outline of a head with wispy hair. It was as if someone had stood there for a very, very long time, their form acting as a shield against the settling grime, their image etched into the glass by their own enduring presence. A perfect, negative silhouette of the old woman. A cold stone of certainty dropped into his stomach. This was no trick of the light, no coincidence. He took a stumbling step back, his heart hammering against his ribs. As he did, the clean patch on the glass seemed to shimmer. The negative space didn't move, but a presence solidified within it. The old woman was there again, not behind the glass, but on it, a phantom image superimposed over the dusty void of the room. Her vacant eyes, now holding a glimmer of ancient recognition, met his. Her clasped hands unclasped. Slowly, with a grace that was both gentle and horrifying, she raised one pale, translucent hand and curled her fingers in a slow, deliberate wave. The friendly, professional nod he had given her earlier now felt like a grotesque parody. This was not a greeting. It was an acknowledgement, a welcome. Terror, white-hot and absolute, flooded Tom's system. He turned and ran. He did not stop to retrieve the mailbag he had dropped on the path. He did not look back. He ran until the burn in his lungs overpowered the ice in his veins, only slowing when he burst into the bright, noisy sanctuary of the local sorting office. He said nothing to his colleagues, their cheerful banter a world away from the silent horror of Derby Street. It was only later, in the hushed confines of the pub, with old man Harris, a retired postman who had walked the same route 30 years prior, that he found the missing piece. His hands shook as he described the woman, the empty houses, the wave. Harris listened, his own gnarled hands wrapped around a pint, his eyes growing distant. He nodded slowly, a sad recognition dawning on his weathered face. "Aye," Harris said, his voice a low rumble. "That'll be Morag. Morag Finley. She had the round before me, back in the 60s, loved this patch, knew everyone. Had a heart attack one Tuesday morning, right outside number 24. They found her with a bundle of letters still clutched in her hand." He took a long, slow drink. Never could leave her round, I suppose. Some folks are just tied to their duty. The explanation did not lessen the chill that had settled deep within Tom. It only gave the horror a name and a history. He never went back to Derby Street, arranging a permanent swap for another route. But sometimes, on damp grey days, he would catch himself looking up at the windows of empty houses, half expecting to see a stooped figure in a faded housecoat, a silent, eternal postwoman forever waiting at her station. There is a certain quality of fog that does more than obscure. It transforms, turning the familiar into the foreign and the mundane, into the mysterious. The morning mist on Misty Lane in Yorkshire was of this variety, a thick, woolly blanket that swallowed sound and distance whole, reducing the world to a sphere of 20 feet in any direction. Emma ran through its heart, her breath pluming in the damp, cold air, the rhythmic thud of her trainers on the wet tarmac the only anchor to reality. This was her usual route, a peaceful, tree-lined stretch on the outskirts of town, but today it felt like a path through another world. The towering oaks that usually stood as friendly, familiar giants were now looming, indistinct pillars, their highest branches lost in the oppressive grey-white. It was the silence that first unnerved her, not just the absence of traffic or birdsong, but the way the fog seemed to absorb noise, creating a vacuum of sound that made the beat of her own heart loud in her ears. Then she saw them. Silhouettes. They stood at regular intervals along the roadside, positioned just where the pavement met the wild grasses of the bordering fields. At first, she took them for oddities of the landscape, particularly thick fence posts, or perhaps new abstract sculptures installed by the parish council. They were humanoid in shape, tall and slender, their forms rendered in perfect, motionless black against the shifting grey of the fog. She passed the first one without breaking stride, her mind already categorizing it as a quirky piece of public art. But as she drew level, a prickle of awareness raised the fine hairs on her arms. It was not the shape itself, but the texture of its stillness. It was not the inert stillness of wood or stone, but a poised, watchful stillness, like a predator frozen mid-stride. She glanced at its featureless face as she ran by, and a bizarre, irrational conviction seized her. It was looking at her. Shaking her head, she pushed the thought away. The fog was playing tricks, conjuring phantoms from the shadows and paranoia from the silence. She focused on her breathing, on the steady rhythm of her feet, but the lane was long and the silhouettes were many. She passed a second, then a third. Each one was identical in its vague humanoid form, and each one elicited the same visceral response: a sudden, sharp intake of breath, a quickening of her pulse, the undeniable skin-crawling sensation of being observed. Their heads seemed to be angled toward the road, toward her, their blank attention a physical pressure in the fog. Her pace, once steady and meditative, became hurried, almost frantic. She stopped looking at them directly, keeping her gaze fixed on the road ahead, but her peripheral vision was a traitor, feeding her mind images of those dark, silent forms standing their endless vigil. The fog seemed to thicken, the world shrinking further until it contained only her, the strip of tarmac beneath her feet, and the next waiting sentinel emerging from the gloom. Her anxiety, a small cold seed planted by the first figure, had now blossomed into a thorny vine of dread, tightening around her chest with every shadow she passed. This was no longer a morning jog. It was a gauntlet run, a journey past an audience of silent, unmoving watchers who saw everything and revealed nothing. The final sentinel stood just where the lane began its gentle curve toward the main road and safety. Emma fixed her eyes on it, a dark exclamation mark in the fog, her lungs burning and her legs aching with the effort of her panicked sprint. She was 10 feet away, then 5, the details of the silhouette refusing to resolve into anything more than a tall, man-shaped cutout of absolute blackness. And then the impossible happened. It moved. Not a shift in posture, not a sway in the wind, for there was no wind. It was the head, the featureless, oblong shape that served as its head turned. It was a smooth, seamless motion, devoid of the mechanics of muscle and bone, a simple, horrifying reorientation. It turned in perfect unison with the others. From the corner of her eye, she saw the previous sentinel, 20 yards back, also turn its head. And the one before that, and the one before that, a wave of synchronized attention rippling back down the length of Misty Lane. Every single one of those motionless watchers now focusing its blank gaze directly on her. A soundless scream caught in Emma's throat. The primal part of her brain, the part that knew predators and prey, shrieked in utter terror. She put on a final, desperate burst of speed, her body screaming in protest as she flew past the last figure. She felt the weight of its gaze like a physical blow between her shoulder blades, a cold, pinpoint pressure that promised pursuit. She did not look back. She rounded the bend, her feet pounding on the tarmac, expecting at any moment to feel a cold, hard hand on her shoulder, or to see one of the dark forms standing in the road ahead, having moved with impossible speed to cut her off. But no pursuit came. Only the silence, and the fog, and the hammering of her own heart. She ran until the grey began to thin, until the shapes of hedges and gates became solid and real again. A weak, watery sun broke through the mist, its light feeble but blessedly normal. Gasping for air, she finally dared to stop and look back the way she had come. Misty Lane lay bathed in the emerging morning light, a perfectly ordinary country lane. The oak trees stood clear and distinct, their leaves dripping with condensation. The fields stretched away green and peaceful, and the road was empty, completely, utterly empty. The silhouettes were gone. There were no statues, no fence posts, no sculptures. There was nothing but the wet pavement and the grassy verge where they had stood. It was as if they had never been there at all, as if the fog itself had sculpted them from its own substance and then, with the coming of the sun, had drawn them back into nothingness. The relief was so profound it made her knees weak. She walked the rest of the way home on trembling legs, the normal sounds of the waking world, a distant car, a barking dog, the chatter of sparrows, sounding like a symphony after the suffocating silence of the lane. Yet, the memory of those turning heads was seared into her mind, a cold, hard knot of fear in her gut. She never jogged down Misty Lane again, taking a longer, brighter route through the town centre instead. Weeks later, in the local pub, she overheard two old-timers talking in low tones about the lane. "Aye, the watchers," one said, nodding sagely. "See 'em on the misty mornings sometimes. They were miners, the whole lot of 'em, caught in a collapse a century back. The rescue never found the bodies. They say they're still standing guard, waiting to be found." The tale, spoken so casually, confirmed everything. Emma shivered, nursing her drink, forever haunted by the knowledge that on certain mornings the fog on Misty Lane did not just obscure, but revealed, a silent, patient audience of ghosts, forever watching for someone who would never come. There is a particular kind of madness that lies not in chaos, but in a pattern repeated one time too many, a rhythm that becomes a cage. For Lisa, that cage was built from numbers. Her evening walk with Buster, her boisterous golden retriever, along the genteel curve of Oak Drive in Edinburgh, was a cherished ritual. The street was a picture of Georgian elegance, its sandstone townhouses standing shoulder to shoulder in a display of timeless grace, each with its own glossy black door and gleaming brass number. It was a scene of perfect, predictable order, a place where nothing was ever out of place, until it was. The first flicker of dissonance was so subtle she almost missed it. Number 27, with its bay window filled with ferns, slid past. Then came number 25, its doorstep scrubbed clean. Her mind, lulled by the rhythm of the walk and Buster's happy panting, was already anticipating number 23. But the number screwed. To the brickwork beside the next black door was not 23, it was 13. A small, cold prickle touched the back of her neck. An error, surely, a quirk of the numbering system, a holdover from some long-forgotten civic decision. She walked on, her pace slowing almost imperceptibly. Number 11 should have been next. Instead, it was another 13. This one was identical to the last. The same font, the same aged brass, fixed to an identical door on an identical house. Buster, trotting ahead, let out a soft whine, his tail drooping from its usual cheerful flag. Lisa's grip on the lead tightened. She stopped, staring at the number. This was no error. This was an impossibility. She turned and looked back the way she had come. The street stretched behind her, a serene, tree-lined avenue, the houses receding into the soft twilight. But the numbers she knew should be there were gone. In their place, as far as she could see, every single door bore the same brass numeral, 13. A wave of vertigo washed over her, so intense she reached out to steady herself against a cold iron railing. The air, which had been fresh with the scent of damp earth and blooming jasmine, now felt thin and used, as if she were breathing the same lungful over and over. The elegant symmetry of Oak Drive had become a hall of mirrors, a fractal nightmare of repeating facades. She started walking again, her steps hurried and unsteady, Buster pressing close to her leg, his whines growing more persistent. She passed another 13. And another. Each house was a perfect replica of its neighbor, the same potted plant by the door, the same pattern in the lace curtains, the same brass 13 gleaming under the emerging streetlights. There was no break in the pattern, no deviation, no end. Panic began to flutter in her chest, a trapped bird beating against her ribs. She tried to turn down a side street, only to find that the gaps between the houses, which should have led to cobbled mews and gardens, were now just shallow, bricked in. Recesses, dead ends in the endless row of 13. She was trapped. The street had folded in on itself, becoming a loop, a numeric Ouroboros from which there was no escape. Buster planted his feet and refused to move further, a low growl rumbling in his throat as he stared at a patch of shadow between two identical houses. It was from this shadow that another figure emerged. A man, looking as lost and bewildered as she felt, his own dog, a nervous-looking terrier, cowering at his heels. Their eyes met across the short, impossible distance, and a silent, desperate understanding passed between them. He was caught in it too. He approached her, his face pale in the twilight. "I've been walking for half an hour," he said, his voice hushed with a fear that mirrored her own. "It's just 13, all of them. My name's James." In that shared, terrifying reality, on a street that had forgotten all other numbers, they became reluctant allies, two lost souls united by the oppressive, repeating geometry of the number 13, their only goal a desperate, shared search for an exit that logic insisted could not exist. The oppressive repetition of the number 13 had woven a cage around their senses, a labyrinth built not of walls, but of maddening, inescapable logic. Lisa and James stood together in the center of Oak Drive, two castaways on an island of repeating sandstone and gleaming brass. Buster and the terrier, Pip, huddled at their feet, their animal instincts bristling at the wrongness that permeated the very air. Every direction offered the same view, an endless parade of black doors, each branded with that same mocking numeral. The streetlights flickered on, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to stitch the houses together into a single, unbroken entity. Walking forward was futile, they had both already proven that. Turning back was the same. The side passages were nothing but shallow, brick-filled lies. James ran a trembling hand through his hair, his eyes wild with a trapped energy. "It's a loop," he whispered, the words tasting of dust and dread. "A perfect loop. We're just going around and around." He pointed a shaky finger at a house across the street, its bay window identical to a dozen others. "I've passed that specific fern 3 times." I counted. Lisa nodded, her throat too tight for speech. Her mind, a rational thing accustomed to spreadsheets and schedules, was fracturing under the strain. The numbers were a command, a rule written into the fabric of this place, and to follow the path was to obey the rule, to be forever caught in its cycle. Buster nudged her hand with his wet nose, a soft whine escaping him. She looked down at his trusting, fearful eyes, and an idea, fragile and desperate, sparked in the chaos of her thoughts. It was the kind of idea born of fairy tales and childhood games, an act of defiance against an unseen game master. "What if we don't look?" she said, her voice a rasp. James stared at her, uncomprehending. "The numbers. They're a trick. A path for our eyes to follow. What if we break the path? What if we just walk without seeing?" Understanding dawned on James's face, a flicker of wild hope in the deepening gloom. It was a ridiculous plan, a leap of faith into utter blindness. But every rational option had been exhausted. The street itself was the trap, and its mechanism was their own perception. To break the mechanism, they had to surrender their primary sense. Eyes closed, he agreed, his voice gaining a sliver of strength. "We hold on to the dogs, link arms and just walk, straight. No matter what we hear, no matter what we feel, we don't open our eyes." The act of closing their eyelids was one of the most terrifying things Lisa had ever done. It was a voluntary plunge into the abyss, a surrender to the very uncertainty that was hunting them. The world vanished, replaced by a field of dancing red spots and the thunderous sound of her own heartbeat. She felt James's arm, solid and reassuring, link with hers. She tightened her grip on Buster's lead, feeling the dog press against her leg, a warm, living anchor. "Ready?" James murmured. "Ready," she breathed. They took the first step together into the void. Without sight, the other senses screamed in protest. The sound of their footsteps on the pavement was grotesquely loud, each scuff and tap a potential signal of an approaching horror. The cool evening air felt suddenly alive, brushing against their skin like inquisitive, unseen fingers. A faint, coppery taste filled Lisa's mouth, the taste of pure fear. She fought the urge to peek, to just crack one eyelid and confirm that the world of 13 was still there. Her mind conjured images of the houses leaning in, the doors opening, of silent, watching figures now free to approach because their prey had chosen blindness. They kept walking, a slow, shuffling, agonizing procession. A minute stretched into an eternity in the dark. Lisa counted her steps, a frantic, internal mantra to keep the panic at bay. 20 steps, 30. The pressure in her chest was immense, a physical weight of dread. 50 steps. She could feel James trembling against her, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. Buster whined, a high, nervous sound, and she felt him try to pull to the side, but she held firm, steering them straight. They were committed. There was no going back. And then a change. A breeze, fresh and untainted by the scent of recycled air, washed over her face. The oppressive, looping silence was broken by the distant, blessed hum of a car engine. The texture of the ground beneath her feet shifted subtly, the smooth pavement giving way to the grittier feel of the main road's tarmac. "Now," James whispered, his voice cracking with tension. As one, they opened their eyes. The world snapped back into focus, but it was a different world. They were no longer on the endless, repeating curve of Oak Drive. They were standing at its very entrance, right where the neat sandstone gave way to the bustling, ordinary city. Behind them, Oak Drive lay serene and peaceful in the twilight, its houses displaying a perfectly normal sequence of numbers, 20, 7, 25, 23, stretching away into the distance. The cage was gone. The numeric maze had vanished as if it had never been. A shuddering, simultaneous sigh of relief escaped them. They unlinked arms, the sudden separation feeling both freeing and strangely lonely. James looked at Lisa, his eyes wide with the shared impossible memory of what they had just endured. I have to go," he stammered, already backing away, pulling a confused Pip behind him. He offered a shaky, wordless nod, a gesture of profound, unspoken understanding, and then he was gone, melting into the evening foot traffic. Lisa stood for a long moment, Buster leaning heavily against her, his tail giving a tentative, half-hearted wag. The relief was a tidal wave, so powerful it left her weak, but beneath it, a deep, cold wariness had taken root. They had escaped, but they had not solved anything. They had simply broken a rule they never understood. She took one last look at the entrance to Oak Drive, a perfectly normal street that held a perfectly abnormal secret. Then she turned and walked away, her steps quick and purposeful. The memory of the number 13 burned into her mind like a brand, a permanent reminder that some streets were not just addresses, but traps waiting to be sprung. There is a sound so deeply woven into the fabric of a city that its absence is more jarring than its presence, the sound of an engine. On Carlton Road in Liverpool, that sound had become unmoored from its source, a phantom heartbeat in the twilight. David pulled his own aging sedan to the curb, the familiar grumble of its motor cutting out to leave a vacuum of silence. He was early for his weekly visit to his aunt, and the quiet, tree-lined street with its rows of parked cars seemed the perfect place to kill 10 minutes with a phone call. Oh. Evening was still, the air cool and carrying the distant, muffled sounds of the city. He scrolled through his contacts, the screen's glow illuminating his face. It was then that the first engine rumbled to life. The sound was low and throaty, the healthy purr of a well-maintained car. David glanced up, expecting to see brake lights flaring, a vehicle pulling out. But the street was motionless. The sound was coming from a sleek, dark saloon parked 3 cars ahead, its windows tinted, its interior dark. The engine idled with a steady, patient rhythm, a beast waiting to be unleashed. Yet, no one sat in the driver's seat. The car was empty. David frowned, lowering his phone. A remote start, he reasoned, a fancy modern feature. Someone must be in a nearby house, key fob in hand, warming up the car for a journey. He returned to his phone, but his attention was fractured. Another engine coughed and turned over, this one from an old estate car across the street. Then another, a high-performance snarl from a sporty coupe further down. Within a minute, the quiet street was filled with a dissonant orchestra of automotive life. Engines hummed, grumbled and roared from a dozen stationary vehicles. It was a car park that had come alive, a chorus of mechanical readiness with no conductor, no drivers, no purpose. David stared, his phone forgotten in his lap. Not a single interior light was on, not a single shadow moved behind a wheel. The cars sat like dormant metal insects, their mechanical hearts beating for no one. A cold, prickling sensation crawled up his spine. This was not technology. This was something else. The sounds were too varied, too organic. The old estate car had a distinct piston slap. The sporty coupe had a turbo whine. They were the unique voices of individual machines, not the uniform thrum of a remote start system. The air, once cool, now felt thick and heavy, saturated with the smell of exhaust fumes that had no right to be there. He rolled down his window. The cacophony swelling, a symphony of ghost engines idling in the gathering dark. His eyes were drawn back to the first car, the dark saloon. Its engine note was the steadiest, the most purposeful. A morbid, nervous curiosity took hold of him. He had to see. He had to confirm the emptiness, to prove to himself that there was a rational explanation hiding in that dark interior. He opened his car door, the sound of its hinge a small domestic noise lost in the automotive growl. Stepping onto the pavement, he felt exposed, a living man walking among sleeping mechanical giants. He took a tentative step toward the saloon, then another, his senses heightened, every nerve ending screaming that he was trespassing in a place that did not follow the rules he knew. He was 10 feet away when the saloon's engine cut out. The silence was as shocking as a gunshot. It wasn't a sputter or a stall, it was an instantaneous cessation, as if a switch had been thrown. In that single, silent moment, the entire street fell quiet. One by one, in perfect rapid succession, every other engine died. The grumble, the snarl, the hum, all gone, extinguished like a row of candles in a sudden draught. The estate car, the coupe, the family hatchback, all fell silent, leaving only the faint, distant sounds of a normal Liverpool evening. David stood frozen, halfway between his own car and the now silent saloon. The sudden quiet was more menacing than the noise had been. It felt like a held breath, a collective pause from the street itself. The parked cars were just cars again, inert metal and glass, but the memory of their phantom chorus echoed in his ears, and the feeling of being watched by the empty vehicles was a palpable force. Unease solidified into a cold knot of dread in his stomach. The phone call to his aunt could wait. This street, with its ghost engines, was not a place to linger. He turned and walked quickly back to his car, his decision made. He had to leave. Now. The silence that fell over. Carlton Road was heavier than the engine noise had been. A thick, watchful quiet that seemed to press in on David's car from all sides. He fumbled the key into the ignition, his hands trembling, the metallic scrape unnaturally loud. The turn of the key, the cough and sputter of his own engine coming to life. These were sounds of the living world, a desperate affirmation of reality. He shoved the gear stick into first, his eyes darting across the dashboard, checking mirrors that showed only the still, dark forms of the parked cars. They were just cars again, silent, inert. He released the handbrake and eased his foot onto the accelerator, the car rolling forward with a gentle lurch. All he wanted was to put the street and its phantom orchestra behind him. He had traveled no more than 20 feet when the headlights of the sleek, dark saloon, the one that had been the first to speak and the first to fall silent, flared into life. They were blinding, twin suns of pure white that burned through his rear window and flooded his car's interior. A jolt of pure adrenaline shot through him. He stamped on the accelerator, but before his car could respond, the saloon slid backwards from its parking space. It moved with a fluid, impossible grace. No sound of an engine, no squeal of tires. It reversed in a smooth, perfect arc, coming to a stop sideways across the road, completely blocking his path forward. David slammed on the brakes, his car shuddering to a halt. His heart hammered against his ribs like a frantic bird. He threw the gear stick into reverse, intending to flee back the way he had come. But in his rearview mirror, he saw the old estate car perform the same silent, elegant maneuver, gliding out to block the road behind him. He was trapped. A cage of metal and glass was forming around him. To his left and right, other parked cars began to stir. They didn't start their engines, they simply moved, sliding out from the curb with a ghostly, predatory silence, their wheels. Turning without friction, their bodies shifting to create a narrow, twisting corridor down the center of the road. It was a macabre, automated dance, a choreography of obstruction performed by driverless vehicles. Panic was a cold fire in his veins. There was no time for thought, only for instinct. He slammed the car back into first and surged forward, aiming for the gap between the sideways saloon and a van that was nosing out to join it. It was a tight fit, a sliver of asphalt that seemed to shrink as he approached. The screech of tearing metal was horribly loud as his wing mirror clipped the van's bumper, shearing clean off. He didn't care. He was through, his tires squealing as he fought for control, the car fishtailing on the damp tarmac. In his rearview mirror, he saw the saloon disengage itself from the van and begin to follow. Its headlights were relentless, pinning him in their glare. It accelerated, closing the distance with that same silent, effortless speed, a predator gliding after its prey. He could see the empty driver's seat through the rear window, a void of darkness that was more terrifying than any visible occupant. He pushed his own car harder, the engine screaming in protest as he wove through the labyrinth of moving vehicles, each one sliding into his path only to be swerved around at the last possible second. It was a high-speed nightmare, a slalom course designed by a phantom traffic controller. For 3 blocks, the silent pursuit continued, the saloon a constant menacing presence in his mirror. Then, as he shot out of the far end of Carlton Road and onto a brighter, busier thoroughfare, the pursuit ended as abruptly as it had begun. He glanced in the mirror one last time to see the saloon simply stop dead in the middle of the junction behind him, its headlights extinguished, and it sat there, a dark, abandoned sculpture in the stream of normal, oblivious traffic. It did not move again. David drove for another hour, aimlessly, until the shaking in his hands subsided. The next day, the memory burning in his mind, he went to the local library and delved into the archives of the Liverpool Echo. It took hours of sifting through microfiche, through reports of minor crimes and civic announcements, before he found it. A small article from November 1962. A thick, freezing fog had blanketed the city. On Carlton Road, a driver had lost control on the icy surface, sparking a catastrophic, multi-vehicle pile-up. 7 cars were involved, a tangled wreck of steel and glass. The article listed the makes and models: a dark saloon, an old estate car, a sporty coupe, the identities of the ghost engines. There were no survivors. The street, it seemed, had never forgotten the violent, chaotic end of that night, and on certain evenings it faithfully, horrifyingly reenacted its final tragic moments for anyone unlucky enough to be passing through. There is a special kind of magic that belongs to children, a belief that the world is full of secrets meant just for them, whispered on the wind and hidden in the cracks of the pavement. For the children of the Birmingham terraces, that magic lived in Drainage Alley, a narrow, forgotten cut-through where the real world ended and adventure began. The alley was a place of dripping walls and perpetual shadow, its most prominent features being the wide, iron-grated storm drains that punctuated the cobbles at regular intervals. These drains were the gateways to 100 imagined kingdoms, lairs for trolls, tunnels to the center of the earth, mouths of slumbering beasts. But on certain still afternoons, when the hum of the city seemed to soften and the light turned thick and golden, the drains offered a different kind of magic, one that was colder and far more personal. It began as a faint susurration, a sound like dry leaves skittering across concrete, so soft it could be mistaken for the breeze playing in the alley's depths. But the air in Drainage Alley was always still. Trapped between the high brick walls, the sound would coalesce, forming not words, but the ghost of words, the shape of a name. It was never a shout, always a whisper, a sibilant, beckoning call that seemed to rise from the dark, wet spaces beneath the grates. The children had a dozen names for the phenomenon: the gutter callers, the drain voices, the name whisperers. They had rules, too, passed down from older siblings with the solemnity of ancient law. You never answered. You never went too close. You never, ever looked for too long. Tim, a boy of 9 with a constellation of freckles across his nose and a mind that devoured puzzles, found the rules increasingly difficult to obey, while his friends, Liam and Chloe, would shriek with a mixture of terror and delight and scramble back from the drains whenever the whispers started. Tim would hang back, his head cocked, listening. He had heard his own name once, a week ago, a soft, drawn-out Timothy that had slithered from the largest drain near the alley's dead end. It hadn't been scary, not really. It had been curious. It had sounded lonely. Today the whispers were active. A low, murmuring chorus emanated from the grates, a tangled web of half-heard syllables. Liam, his face pale, pointed a shaky finger toward the far end of the alley. "It's calling for you again, Tim. Don't listen." Tim stood his ground, his heart beating a quick, excited rhythm against his ribs. The other children were already retreating, their game forgotten, their earlier bravado evaporated. Chloe shot him a worried look. "Come on, Tim, it's not a game." But for Tim, it was the ultimate game. It was a riddle waiting to be solved. He took a small, hesitant step forward, his trainers scuffing on the damp cobbles. The general murmur from the drains seemed to quieten, as if the alley itself were holding its breath. Then, from the large, rust-flecked grate, just 10 feet away, it came again. "Timothy." This time, it was clearer. It was a voice, but not one he could place. It was neither old nor young, male nor female. It was simply a voice, smooth as river stone and cold as the water that trickled in the drains below. It called his name not with menace, but with a plaintive, compelling need. It was an invitation. "Tim, no!" Liam's voice was a desperate squeak from the safety of the alley's entrance. Tim ignored him. The whisper was a hook in his mind, reeling him in. The world narrowed to the iron grate and the darkness beyond it. The warnings of his friends became distant echoes, the rules of childhood magic now seeming like childish fears. He took another step, then another, drawn by an insatiable curiosity that overpowered every instinct screaming for him to run. The rusted iron of the grate grew larger in his vision, the geometric patterns of its bars a cage over an infinite blackness. The air around it was several degrees colder, carrying a faint, earthy smell of decay and wet stone. He was close enough now to see the trickle of water gleaming in the murk below, close enough to hear the faint, wet echo that followed the whisper of his name. He was at the edge, peering down into the secret heart of Drainage Alley, utterly captivated by the eerie, lonely sound that called for him, and him alone. The world had shrunk to the circle of rusted iron and the profound darkness it framed. Tim leaned further over the drain, his small hands gripping the cold, wet bars for balance. The whisper of his name still hung in the air, a spectral echo that seemed to coil up from the depths like a ribbon of mist. He squinted, his eyes straining to pierce the absolute blackness below. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of dripping water and the thud of his own heart in his ears. Then they appeared. 2 points of light, faint and sickly green, ignited in the darkness. They were not the reflection of the alley's dim light. They generated their own ghastly luminescence, hovering in the void about 6 feet down. As his vision adjusted, he saw they were eyes, not the eyes of a rat or a trapped animal, but large lidless orbs that held no pupil, no white, only a swirling phosphorescent green. They did not blink, they simply were, fixed on him with an ancient, patient intelligence. The space around them remained formless, a deeper blackness that suggested a presence too vast, too alien, to be fully seen. The voice came again, no longer a whisper from the void, but directly from those glowing eyes. It was clearer now, devoid of its earlier plaintive quality, replaced by a flat, undeniable command. "Tim," it said, the sound seeming to form in the cold air right in front of his face. "Come down." The words were not an invitation anymore. They were a summons. A compulsion settled over him, a heavy, woolly feeling in his mind that smothered his fear and his curiosity alike, leaving only a blank, unquestioning obedience. His fingers began to loosen their grip on the grate. The idea of climbing down into that wet, light-devouring darkness seemed not like a terror, but the next logical, inevitable step. The glowing eyes held him, their hypnotic swirl pulling at his will, promising answers to questions he hadn't even thought to ask. It was the violent, desperate yank on the back of his jacket that shattered the trance. Liam, his face a mask of pure terror, hauled backwards with all his 10-year-old strength, pulling Tim stumbling away from the drain's edge. The spell broke. The cold, commanding presence vanished, and the crushing weight on his mind lifted, replaced by a surge of raw, undiluted horror. A final, sibilant hiss of frustration seemed to slither from the grate before the glowing eyes winked out, plunging the drain back into simple, empty blackness. For a single, frozen second, the two boys stared at the grate, then at each other. Then, instinct took over. They turned and ran. Their feet pounded on the cobbles, a frantic, panicked drumbeat that echoed off the narrow walls. They did not stop, did not look back, bursting out of the alley's mouth and into the shocking normality of the sunlit street beyond. They ran until their lungs burned and their legs gave way, collapsing on a patch of grass a safe distance away, gasping for air, their bodies trembling with the aftershock of their flight. That night, and for many nights after, Tim's sleep was a battleground. The dream was always the same. He was back at the grate, peering down. The glowing eyes would appear, and the voice, now a chorus of 1,000 dry, rustling whispers, would call his name. In the dream, Liam never pulled him back. In the dream, his fingers would slip from the iron and he would fall, endlessly into the green, watching eyes and the waiting darkness below. He would wake, drenched in a cold sweat, the echo of his own name the only sound in the quiet of his room. The magic of Drainage Alley was forever broken, its adventure curdled into a waking nightmare. He never went back, and he made sure to warn the younger children who still played there, his voice low and serious, his freckles standing out starkly on his pale face. He told them of the name Whisperers, not as a game, but as a cold, hard truth. He told them about the eyes in the dark and the voice that didn't ask but commanded. He made them understand the oldest, most important rule, the one he had nearly broken: you never, ever answer when the drain calls your name. There is a loneliness particular to the late-night bus, a rolling island of artificial light, adrift in a sea of sleeping city. For Anna, the number 42 through the heart of London was her nightly vessel, a chariot of weary souls and rattling windows that carried her from the fluorescent glare of her office to the quiet sanctuary of her flat. Tonight, the bus was sparsely populated, its upper deck a dim cave of empty seats and the low hum of the engine. She slumped into her usual spot halfway down, the vinyl seat cold through her trousers, and let her head rest against the window, watching the rain-streaked world slide past in a smear of sodium orange and neon reflections. The rhythm was familiar, the lurching stops and starts, the hiss of the doors, the murmured thanks of disembarking passengers. It was a script she knew by heart, a comfortable, monotonous ballet of urban transit. The first flicker happened as the bus pulled away from a stop near the British Museum. A man in a long dark coat was sitting 2 rows ahead, on the left. In the window's reflection, he was a solid, normal presence. But when Anna's tired eyes focused directly on him, his outline seemed to waver, like a television signal struggling for coherence. For a fraction of a second, he wasn't there. The seat was empty, the space he occupied a pocket of nothingness. Then he snapped back into existence, his coat, his posture, all exactly as they had been. Anna blinked, rubbing her eyes. Fatigue, she told herself. Too many hours staring at a screen. She looked away, focusing on her own faint reflection in the glass. At the next stop, a woman in a nurse's uniform from a bygone era, a crisp pale blue dress and a starched white cap, boarded and took a seat across the aisle. Anna watched her out of the corner of her eye. The woman sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on some point in the middle distance. Then, as the bus passed under a bright street lamp, the light poured through her. For a heart-stopping moment, Anna could see the pattern of the seat fabric through the woman's shoulder and back. She was translucent, a photograph laid over the real world. Anna's breath caught in her throat. She looked around, her heart beginning to beat a frantic tattoo. The other passengers, a student with headphones, a man reading a paper, a woman staring at her phone, showed no reaction. They hadn't seen it, or they were choosing not to see. A deep, unnatural cold began to seep into the air around her, a chill that had nothing to do with the bus's heating system. It was a pocket of winter, a localized frost that made the fine hairs on her arms stand up. She pulled her jacket tighter, her fingers numb. The bus rumbled on, and with every stop, the phenomenon repeated. A figure in a flat cap and overalls flickered in and out of a rear seat. A child in short trousers and a woolen jumper appeared for one stop, staring out the window with hollow eyes, only to be gone the next time Anna looked, the seat empty and dry despite the rain still sheeting down outside. They were all here, these spectral commuters, going about their eternal, unseen journeys, their presence marked only by these brief, terrifying lapses in reality and the sudden bone-deep cold that accompanied them. Anna sank lower in her seat, trying to make herself small, to become just another unnoticed passenger in this rolling, haunted house. She focused on her breathing, on the mundane details of the bus, the advert for a musical, the list of rules above the driver's cab, the rhythmic swipe of the wipers. But her eyes were drawn, again and again, to the flickering forms. The student with the headphones got off, replaced by a man in a World War I-era army uniform who sat for 3 stops in perfect, ghostly stillness before dissolving into the air. No one else flinched. No one else seemed to feel the Arctic drafts that followed these phantom riders on and off the bus. The familiar, monotonous script of her nightly journey had been rewritten into a horror story, and Anna was the only one in the audience, growing more unnerved with every lurch of the bus and every new, chilling passenger who stepped out of the past and into the dim, rolling light of the number 42. The bus had become a gallery of the dead, a rolling exhibition of lives interrupted, and Anna was its sole, terrified patron. She huddled in her seat, the vinyl now feeling like a slab of ice beneath her, the unnatural cold from the phantom passengers having seeped deep into her bones. She kept, her eyes fixed on her own trembling hands, refusing to look up, terrified of what new anachronism might flicker into existence. The hiss of the doors at each stop was a fresh wave of dread. Would another one get on? Would one of the existing apparitions notice her, the one living soul who could perceive their ghostly transit? The answer came not from a new arrival, but from a shift in the seat beside her. The air temperature plummeted so abruptly her breath misted in front of her face. She dared a glance to her right. The seat, empty moments before, was now occupied. A middle-aged man in a shabby 1970s-style brown suit sat there, his hands resting on his knees. He was more solid than the others, his form only slightly translucent, as if he were fighting to maintain his presence. His face was pale, etched with lines of a quiet, perpetual sorrow, and his eyes, when they turned to her, held a depth of loneliness that was almost physically painful to behold. Anna froze, a statue of fear. She wanted to scream, to flee to the lower deck, but her body was locked in place, held captive by his mournful gaze. He didn't speak at first. He simply looked at her, and in that look, she felt the weight of decades, of routines unfulfilled and journeys never completed. Then he leaned toward her, just slightly. His voice, when it came, was not a sound that traveled through the air, but one that formed directly inside her mind, a dry, papery whisper that rustled in the silence of her own skull. "They never found my watch," the whisper sighed. "A silver fob watch. My father gave it to me. The bus, it left the road, so dark in the water, so cold. We were just going home." Images, fleeting and grainy, flickered behind Anna's eyes. The violent lurch of a bus, the shattering of glass, the terrifying, inexorable rush of black, icy water, the desperate final struggle for a pocket of air that wasn't there. It was not a memory of her own, but a ghost of one, implanted in her mind with the force of a dying man's last thought. She saw his face, younger, contorted in panic, his hand clutching at the empty chain on his waistcoat, where the watch should have been. "Please," the whisper pleaded, its tone shifting from recollection to a desperate, aching need. "Remember us. Someone has to remember. We're so lost. We just need to be remembered." The plea was not threatening, but profoundly, heartbreakingly sad. The fear that had gripped Anna began to thaw, not into comfort, but into a deep, resonant empathy. This was not a monster. This was a person, a soul shattered in a moment of violence. condemned to repeat his final journey forever, his only connection to the world of the living, a desperate request for acknowledgement. He wasn't asking for vengeance or for company in his damnation. He was simply asking not to be forgotten. She met his eyes and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was a promise, a silent vow that she would carry the memory of his story, of his lost watch and his cold, dark end. A look of profound, ethereal relief washed over his translucent features. The deep sorrow in his eyes softened, just for a moment, into something like gratitude. Then the bus hissed to a stop, her stop. The sound of the doors opening was like a spell being broken. She looked from the ghost to the familiar street lamp outside her flat, the real world waiting just steps away. When she looked back, the seat was empty. The man in the brown suit was gone. The crushing cold was gone with him, the air in the bus returning to its normal, slightly stale temperature. The other flickering passengers seemed to have vanished too, leaving only the living, breathing commuters, oblivious to the spectral drama that had just unfolded. Anna stumbled off the bus, her legs weak, her mind reeling. She stood on the pavement, watching the red taillights of the number 42 disappear into the London night. The shaking that gripped her was no longer born solely of fear. It was a complex tremor of terror, and a sorrow so vast it felt oceanic. She carried the ghost's story inside her now, a sacred, terrible burden. She knew she would never take that bus again, but as she turned the key in her own door, stepping into the warmth and light of her home, she knew she would also never forget the man in the brown suit, his lost watch, and the quiet, desperate plea of all the lost souls who rode the spectral buses in the dark, just wanting, more than anything, to be remembered. There is a special, intimate trust a mother places in the world when she walks her child, a faith that the ground will be steady and the path will be safe. For Helen, that trust was woven into the very fabric of Pram Street in Nottingham, a gentle cobbled lane flanked by leaning half-timbered houses that seemed to slumber in the afternoon sun. The Pram, a sleek modern capsule of chrome and navy fabric, rolled with a soft rhythmic whir, its occupant, her 6-month-old son, Leo, slumbering peacefully within, his breath a tiny misting cloud in the crisp autumn air. The world was a watercolor of golden russet, the scent of wood smoke and decaying leaves hanging sweetly in the stillness. It was a picture of perfect, tranquil motherhood, a moment snatched from a storybook. The Pram stopped. It was not a gradual slowing. It was an absolute jarring cessation, as if it had rolled into a wall of solid, invisible glass. The forward momentum wrenched through Helen's arms, the handlebar jolting painfully in her grip. She stumbled, her own body protesting the sudden halt. For a confused second she stared down, expecting to see a stray cobble caught in the wheel, a piece of litter jammed in the axle. But the path ahead was clear, the cobbles smooth and unbroken. She pushed. Nothing. She leaned her weight into it, her muscles straining. The Pram, which had moments before glided with such ease, was now an immovable object, rooted to the spot as if its wheels had been welded to the stone. A cold finger of panic traced its way down her spine. She crouched, her hands frantically checking the wheels, the brakes, the undercarriage. Everything was in perfect order. There was no physical reason for it to stop. Yet an undeniable force held it fast, an unseen grasp that clamped down on the Pram with a strength that defied physics and reason. It was then that she heard it. A sound that froze the blood in her veins and turned her panic into pure, undiluted terror. From the garden of a house just ahead, a derelict Victorian pile that slumped behind a rusted iron fence like a tired old beast, came the sound of a baby crying. It was faint, thin and reedy, a sound that seemed to be filtered through layers of time and dust. It was not the healthy, demanding cry of her own son, but a weak, hopeless whimper. The sound of an infant who has cried for so long it has almost forgotten how to stop. Helen's head snapped up, her eyes locking onto the source of the sound. The house was a skeleton of its former self, its windows boarded or gaping like empty eye sockets, its paint peeled away to reveal the grey, rotting wood beneath. No one could be living there. No one had for decades. The unseen grip on the Pram seemed to tighten in response to the phantom cry. A profound, unnatural cold radiated from the metal frame, seeping through her gloves and into her hands. Leo, disturbed by the sudden stop and the tension thrumming from his mother, began to stir, his own soft gurgles a stark, living counterpoint to the spectral weeping from the abandoned house. The two sounds wove together in the still air, one of vibrant present life, the other a haunting echo from a forgotten tragedy. Helen pulled at the pram with a desperate, frantic strength, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her heart hammering a frantic drum against her ribs. But it was useless. The pram would not budge. She was trapped, held in place by an invisible hand, forced to listen to the ghostly lament of a child that could not possibly be there, a sound that fueled her rising, suffocating panic and rooted her to a spot on Pram Street that had suddenly become a threshold to a nightmare. The pram began to move. It was not a motion Helen initiated. It was a slow, deliberate forward roll, the wheels turning of their own accord on the uneven cobbles. The unseen force that had held it fast now pulled it, a relentless, gentle tug that bypassed her own will and strength entirely. Her hands, still gripping the handlebar, were merely passengers, dragged along for the ride. A soundless scream locked in her throat. Her feet stumbled, her body moving in a macabre, unwilling procession. The pram was steering itself, its trajectory a straight, unwavering line toward the rusted iron gate of the derelict house, the source of the phantom crying. Terror was a cold, metallic taste in her mouth. She pulled back with all her weight, her heels scraping against the stone, her muscles screaming in protest. It was like trying to hold back the tide. The pram did not slow. It moved with a placid, unstoppable certainty, a leaf caught in a ghostly current. Leo, fully awake now, began to whimper, sensing his mother's absolute, suffocating fear. His small, living cries intertwined with the faint, desperate wails from the house, creating a dissonant chorus that echoed in the silent street. The world had narrowed to this slow, horrifying advance. The sleeping houses on either side became a blurred, indifferent audience. The autumn sunlight seemed to dim, the golden afternoon leaching of all its warmth, leaving only the cold, grey dread of the moment. The pram reached the broken gate, which swung inward on a single groaning hinge without being touched. It rolled through, onto the overgrown path that led to the house's blistered front door. Weeds and brambles clawed at the pram's sleek sides, but its progress was unimpeded. Helen followed, a marionette on invisible strings, her eyes wide with horror, fixed on the dark, gaping doorway that grew larger with every step. The phantom crying was clearer here, no longer a distant echo but a sound that seemed to emanate from the very foundations of the rotting structure, a lament woven into the crumbling brick and sagging beams. The pram came to a perfect silent stop directly before the threshold of the door. The pulling force vanished so abruptly that Helen staggered backward, her arms flailing for balance. The sudden release was as shocking as the initial grip had been. For a single, heart-stopping moment, there was absolute silence. Even the ghostly crying ceased, cut off as if a switch had been thrown. The only sound was Leo's soft, confused gurgle from within the pram, and Helen's own ragged, panicked breaths. The stillness was more terrifying than the movement. It felt like a held breath, a moment of judgment. The dark doorway yawned before her, a portal into absolute blackness that promised nothing but decay and forgotten sorrow. Every instinct shrieked at her to grab her son and run, to never look back. With a final, convulsive surge of adrenaline, she lunged forward, her fingers closing around the pram's handle. She did not push it. She wrenched it backward, spinning it away from the house, her body moving on pure animal instinct. Then she ran. She did not stop to look back, her feet pounding on the cobbles, the pram bouncing wildly behind her, Leo now crying in earnest, startled by the violent motion. She ran until the burn in her lungs overpowered the ice in her veins, not stopping until she was safe inside her own home, the door locked and bolted against the memory of the silent, waiting house. It was days before the trembling fully subsided, but the chill of the experience remained. Driven by a need for answers, for some rational peg on which to hang the irrational horror, she went to the local history archives. She spent hours sifting through old maps and council records, her search focused on that specific, dreadful stretch of Pram Street. She found it in a brittle, yellowed newspaper from 1923, a brief, tragic article. The house had not been a private home, but St. Agnes's orphanage. A fire, sparked by a faulty heater in the dead of night, had torn through the wooden building with terrifying speed. The article was sparse on detail, citing the confusion and the inadequacy of the era's fire services, but it listed the final grim tally. 27 children, all under the age of 5, and 3 staff members had perished. The building had never been rebuilt. The land, it was said, was cursed. Helen sat back, the print blurring before her eyes, the phantom crying, the unseen force pulling the pram, a modern vessel of life and care, toward that place of profound loss. It was not malice she had felt, but a desperate collective yearning, a ghostly echo of a tragedy that had stolen dozens of young lives before they had even begun. The unseen grasp of Pram Street was not a monster, but a memory, a sorrow so vast and deep it had soaked into the very stones, forever reaching out from the ashes of a forgotten orphanage, seeking a comfort it would never find. There is a darkness that is more than the absence of light. It is a substance, a living void that consumes and negates. For the small crew of urban explorers, Leo, Maya, and Finn, venturing into the forgotten underbelly of London's Brick Lane. That darkness was a tangible presence, waiting in the old, disused railway arches. Their headlamps cut sharp, white cones through the damp, heavy air, illuminating graffiti-scrawled brickwork and the skeletal remains of rotting wooden pallets. The air was thick with the smells of stagnant water, wet brick, and the faint, sweet tang of decay. It was a cathedral of neglect, and they were its only congregation, their excited whispers and the crunch of their boots on broken glass the only sounds breaking the profound silence. It was Finn who noticed it first. His powerful lead beam, which usually illuminated entire sections of wall with clinical brightness, suddenly died as he swept it across a particular stretch of brickwork near the rear of the arch. The wall didn't just cast a shadow, it swallowed the light whole. The beam didn't fade or diffuse, it simply ceased to exist the moment it touched the aged, soot-blackened bricks, as if a switch had been thrown. "Whoa," he muttered, shaking his headlamp. "Battery's playing up." But it wasn't the battery. Leo aimed his own light at the same spot. The result was identical. His beam, a sturdy and reliable piece of kit, was extinguished upon contact, the wall absorbing its energy without a trace. A perfect, light-devouring rectangle of blackness hung in the space where the illumination should have been. Maya, filming with a camera-mounted light, swung her lens toward it. The camera's LCD screen flickered violently, the image dissolving into static before the light, too, was consumed. The wall drank it all, leaving only an impression of profound, unnatural darkness that seemed deeper than the surrounding gloom. "Okay, that's seriously weird," Leo said, a nervous laugh escaping him. He took a step closer, waving his hand in front of the wall. His hand was visible until it passed into the space where the light died, at which point it vanished into the absolute blackness, as if amputated by the void. He pulled it back quickly, half expecting it to be gone. "It's like a patch of anti-light." They joked about it, their bravado a thin shield against the creeping unease. "Alien technology," Maya quipped, her voice echoing slightly too loud in the vast space. "A secret Ministry of Darkness testing site," Finn added, forcing a grin. But the laughter was hollow, dying quickly in the oppressive air. The jokes were a ritual, an attempt to domesticate the inexplicable, to fold it into the familiar narrative of their urban adventures. Yet, this felt different from finding a forgotten room or a strange piece of machinery. This was a violation of a fundamental law. Light should illuminate, not disappear. As they stood there, their remaining lights carefully averted from the light-eating patch, a new sensation began to impress itself upon them. The initial thrill of discovery curdled into a deep, gnawing disquiet. The air grew heavier, colder, carrying a scent that was now less of damp and more of ozone and old, cold stone. It was a pressure, a watchful presence that seemed to emanate from the wall itself. The silence was no longer just an absence of sound, but a listening silence, a held breath. The patch of darkness wasn't inert. It felt attentive, a gaping maw that was aware of their intrusion, of their feeble flickering lights that dared to challenge its absolute reign. Leo exchanged a look with Maya and Finn, the forced humor gone from their eyes, replaced by a shared, unspoken dread. The oppressive presence was a physical weight on their shoulders, pushing them down, urging them to leave, to flee back to the world of functioning physics and dependable light. But the curiosity that had drawn them here, the same drive that had led them into 100 other forgotten places, now warred with the primal urge to run. The wall wasn't just a curiosity, it was a mystery, a wrongness in the fabric of the place. And against every screaming instinct for self-preservation, that mystery was a lure they could not resist. They had to know. They had to investigate further. The darkness was not passive. It was a living entity, a viscous, light-devouring entity that seemed to pulse with a slow, malevolent rhythm. Leo, Maya, and Finn stood frozen, their collective bravado shattered, replaced by a primal fear that rooted them to the damp concrete floor. The patch of wall was no longer just an anomaly. It was a presence, a void that watched them with a cold, ancient intelligence. Leo, against every screaming instinct, took a single, hesitant step closer, his headlamp carefully angled away from the consuming blackness. He needed to see, to understand the texture of this impossible shadow. As he leaned in, the darkness within the patch shifted. It was not a trick of the light, for there was no light to trick. It was a movement from within the blackness itself, a slow, churning motion like ink swirling in water. Shapes began to form. Elongated, humanoid shadows that twisted and coiled in the absolute dark. They had no features, no substance, only a suggestion of limbs and torsos that writhed in silent agony or restless pacing. They were prisoners in a lightless cell, trapped figures moving in a space that denied their very existence. One of the shadows drifted toward the surface of the void, its form pressing against the boundary between the consuming darkness and the arch's gloom. A silent scream frozen in its motion. A wave of psychic cold, a sensation of utter despair and hopelessness, washed out from the wall and over the three explorers. It was a feeling of being buried alive, of endless falling, of a solitude so complete it became a form of torture. Maya gasped, stumbling backward, her camera clattering to the ground, its light extinguished. Finn made a choked sound, his hand flying to his throat as if the darkness were a physical hand squeezing the air from his lungs. That was enough. The curiosity that had drawn them in was incinerated by the sheer, overwhelming horror of the thing. There was no discussion, no signal. Their minds, in perfect, terrified unison, screamed a single command: run. They turned and fled, their flight a frantic, blind scramble. Their remaining headlamps bounced and jittered, casting crazy, leaping shadows that seemed to mock their terror. The sound of their pounding feet and ragged breaths was a desperate counterpoint to the profound, listening silence they left behind. They did not look back, fearing that to do so would be to meet the gaze of one of those twisting shadows, to feel that cold despair hook into their souls and drag them back into the lightless void. They burst out of the railway arch and into the narrow, graffiti-scarred alley, the cool night air of Brick Lane feeling like a blessing, the distant hum of city life a symphony of sanity after the suffocating silence. They did not stop until they were in a brightly lit pub 2 streets away, huddled around a sticky table, their hands shaking too violently to lift their pints. They spoke in hushed, broken sentences, trying to rationalize, to explain away what they had witnessed. But there was no explanation. The memory of the light-eating wall and the moving shadows within was a brand on their minds. In the days that followed, a restless obsession took hold of Leo. The terror was still there, a cold knot in his stomach, but it was now twined with an insatiable need for context. He spent hours hunched over his laptop in the sterile glow of his flat, diving into the digital underbelly of the city. He trawled through urban exploration forums, local history sites, and archived newspaper databases, his search terms growing increasingly specific: Brick Lane disappearances, missing persons railway arches, light anomalies London. The stories began to surface, fragmentary and chilling. They were tales whispered in the comment sections of obscure blogs, brief, unresolved mentions in decades-old police blotters. A homeless man in the 1980s, last seen heading toward the arches, vanished without a trace. A group of teenagers in the 1990s dared each other to spend the night in the Brick Lane vaults. Only 2 returned, babbling about the dark that moved, their stories dismissed as drug-fueled hysteria. A photographer in the 2000s, known for his work in derelict spaces, was reported missing after telling a friend he'd found a perfect blackness he wanted to capture. His equipment was found, but his body never was. The threads wove together into a grim tapestry. The disappearances were sporadic, spanning decades, the victims often those who dwelled in the margins, the homeless, the thrill-seekers, the lost. The official reports always concluded with the same unsatisfying phrases: no foul play suspected, presumed to have moved on, case closed due to lack of evidence. But Leo saw the pattern. They were all linked to those specific arches, to that patch of wall that consumed more than just light. It consumed people. The moving shadows they had seen were not mere phantoms, they were echoes, the final desperate impressions of those who had been drawn too close, whose light, both literal and metaphorical, had been extinguished forever by the hungry darkness of the wall. The explorers had not just found a strange phenomenon, they had stumbled upon a predator, a patient, lightless thing that had been feeding on the forgotten of London for generations, its existence hidden in the blind spots of the city and the missing persons files. Leo closed his laptop, the screen going dark, and sat in the silence of his room, the weight of his discovery a heavier burden than any fear. There is a rhythm to cycling, a perfect self-sustaining synergy between muscle, machine, and momentum. For Mike, a PhD student who used the daily commute along Cambridge's cycle path 7 to clear his head, that rhythm was a form of meditation. The whir of the chain, the hum of the tires on smooth tarmac, the wind rushing past his ears, it was a symphony of motion that swept the clutter from his mind. Path 7 was his sanctuary, a dedicated route that wound through the city's green edges, away from the choked traffic and the frantic ring of bells. On this crisp, overcast afternoon, he had settled into his usual cadence, his legs pumping in a steady, powerful rhythm, the world blurring into a pleasant smear of college spires and weeping willows. The first tug was so subtle he almost dismissed it as a gust of headwind. It was a sensation not of resistance from the air, but of a direct physical grip on the bike itself, a hand closing gently on the frame and applying a subtle, insistent pressure. His speed, which had been a consistent 20 miles per hour, dipped by 1, then 2. He frowned, shifting his weight, checking his posture. The wind wasn't strong enough for this. He pedaled harder, his quadriceps burning with the extra effort, forcing the pace back up. For a few blessed seconds, the rhythm returned. Then the grip returned, stronger this time. It was no longer a suggestion, but a command. An invisible brake was being applied, a force that clamped down on his wheels and frame with a steady, increasing strength. Frustration, sharp and hot, flared in his chest. He rose from the saddle, putting the full force of his body into each downward stroke. The bike surged forward, fighting the unseen restraint, but the effort was immense, as if he were cycling through setting concrete. His speed plummeted to a crawl. Other cyclists began to overtake him, their machines gliding past with effortless grace, their riders oblivious to the battle he was waging against the empty air. One gave him a curious glance as he sped by, his own journey unimpeded. The injustice of it stung. Why him? What was wrong with his bike? He pulled over to the grassy verge, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his heart pounding from the exertion and rising alarm. The moment he stopped moving, the invisible grip vanished. The bike was just a bike again, light and free. He dismounted, his hands running over the frame in a frantic diagnostic ritual. He spun the wheels, they turned freely, the hubs whispering with well-oiled precision. He checked the brakes, the pads clean and retracted. He examined the tires for a slow puncture, feeling for any telltale softness. There was nothing. The chain was taut, the gears indexed perfectly. The machine was in flawless working order. Bewildered and increasingly unnerved, he remounted and pushed off. For the first 10 yards, all was well. The bike rolled smoothly, the familiar sense of freedom beginning to return. Then, like a ghostly hand settling back onto his shoulder, the pressure returned. It started as a gentle drag, then quickly escalated into that same firm, unmovable grip, slowing him to a frustrating, energy-sapping pace. He pedaled until his legs ached, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool air, but he could not break its hold. It was a sensation of being personally held back, singled out by some capricious, unseen force that inhabited the very path beneath his tires. The frustration curdled into a cold, sharp spike of alarm. This was no mechanical fault, no trick of the wind. This was something else, something that defied explanation and was focused solely on him, turning his peaceful sanctuary into a personal, invisible prison. The grip was no longer a mere pressure, it was a vice, an unyielding cold force that seemed to clench around the very atoms of his bicycle, leeching its momentum and replacing it with a profound, unnatural inertia. Mike's legs burned with the strain, his muscles screaming in protest as he fought against the impossible restraint. Each rotation of the pedals was a Herculean effort, gaining him mere inches on the smooth, mocking tarmac of Path 7. Sweat stung his eyes, and his breath came in ragged, desperate gasps. The world around him, the gentle curve of the river, the distant pinnacles of the colleges, had become a taunting panorama of freedom from which he was cruelly excluded. It was as he strained, his head down, his vision blurring with effort, that he saw them. On his forearms, where they rested on the handlebars, faint greyish marks were blooming on his skin. They were handprints, 5 blurred fingers and a smudged palm on each arm, as if someone or something invisible were gripping him there, its chill spectral flesh leaving a temporary stain on his own. A jolt of pure, undiluted horror shot through him, electrifying his already overtaxed system. This was not some atmospheric anomaly or a fault in the path. This was a personal assault. He was being held, restrained. A phantom rider was clinging to him and his machine, applying its own ghostly brakes. The sight of those faint, accusing prints shattered the last of his rational resistance. A raw, animal panic flooded his veins, burning away the fatigue. He threw his weight forward, his body becoming a single, desperate lever. He didn't just pedal, he attacked the pedals, driving them down with a fury born of absolute terror. A guttural roar tore from his throat, a sound of pure defiance against the unseen. For a few agonizing seconds, nothing happened. The vice held fast, the cold from the spectral hands seeming to seep into his bones. He could feel the presence behind him, a dense, watchful coldness leaning into his back. Then, with a sensation like tearing through thick, frozen cloth, the resistance broke. The sudden release was so violent, the bike lurched forward, the tires screeching as they found purchase on the suddenly free path. Mike nearly lost control, swerving wildly before he wrestled the handlebars straight. He didn't look back. He didn't dare. He poured every ounce of his remaining strength into flight, his legs becoming a frantic, pistoning blur. The wind whipped past his ears, no longer a gentle rush but a blessed roar of speed and escape. He didn't slow down, didn't shift gears, didn't think. He just fled, a hunted creature finally breaking from a trap, the memory of those cold grey handprints burning on his skin like a brand. He did not stop until he was safe within the thrumming, brightly lit confines of the university engineering department, his usual destination now feeling like a fortress. He collapsed onto a bench in the hallway, his body trembling uncontrollably, his bike clattering to the floor beside him. He stared at his arms. The handprints were gone, faded away as if they had never been, but the memory of their chill was seared into his flesh. The official story he gave to concerned colleagues was of a sudden severe cramp, but the haunted look in his eyes betrayed the lie. In the weeks that followed, a new, cautious ritual entered his life. He began to ask subtle, probing questions in the cycling forums he frequented and among the community of Cambridge cyclists. He spoke of unusual resistance on certain paths, careful not to sound unhinged, and slowly, quietly, the stories trickled back to him. A woman who'd felt like she was cycling through syrup on Path 7 one evening. A man who'd abandoned his commute, swearing something had grabbed his wheels. They were fragmented accounts, often laughed off by the tellers themselves, shared in the hushed, embarrassed tones of those who have experienced something that defies the solid, rational world they inhabit. None mentioned handprints. But they all described the same inexplicable, personal force, the same invisible breaks. Mike never rode Path 7 again. He took lengthy, convoluted detours through the city's congested heart, preferring the clamor of traffic and the anger of motorists to the silent, waiting dread of that riverside path. His bicycle, once a symbol of freedom, now felt like a potential liability. Every slight increase in resistance, every odd gust of wind, made his heart stutter and his eyes dart to his arms, half expecting to see the ghostly grey imprints of a grip that had tried to hold him fast forever on the deceptively peaceful tarmac of Cycle Path 7. There is a unique vulnerability to running on a city rooftop, a sense of being both above the world and entirely exposed to it. For Jake, the elevated track known as Rooftop Run in Manchester was a sanctuary, a ribbon of synthetic turf and rubberized asphalt suspended 5 stories above the grimy streets. Up here, the city was a distant, glittering diorama, its sirens and traffic hum reduced to a muted soundtrack. His evening run was a ritual of purification, each footfall a hammer, driving the day's stress into the resilient surface. The air was cooler, cleaner, and the only company was the occasional pigeon cooing from a neighboring ledge, and the vast, bruised canvas of the twilight sky. It was a space for solitude, for the rhythmic, hypnotic trance of a body in motion. The first sound was a soft, syncopated tap that threaded itself into the steady beat of his own footfalls. It came from above. He glanced up instinctively, his eyes scanning the empty, featureless roof of the taller building that ran parallel to the track. There was nothing there but ventilation units and satellite dishes, silhouetted against the fading light. He dismissed it as an echo, a trick of the acoustics in this strange, elevated canyon. The sound of his own steps, bouncing off the low parapet walls and the glass facades of adjacent offices, could easily create such an illusion. He adjusted his breathing and focused on the path ahead, the long, straight stretch that offered a breathtaking view of the Beetham Tower piercing the evening sky. The tapping continued. It wasn't an echo, it was a distinct, separate rhythm, a hard-soled foot striking a hard surface, and it was keeping perfect pace with him. When he sped up, the tapping quickened. When he slowed to a jog, it slowed to a walk. It was a precise, metronomic shadow to his own movement, a phantom footfall from the rooftops above. A cold trickle of unease traced its way down his spine, despite the warmth of exertion. He stopped dead, his trainers squeaking on the rubberized surface. The tapping stopped a half-second later, the silence that followed absolute and unnerving. He stood there, chest heaving, his ears straining. The distant city hum seemed to swell to fill the void. He looked up again, his gaze sweeping the roofline more carefully this time, searching for a maintenance worker, a security guard, another runner on a higher level. The rooftops were a maze of different heights and angles, a jagged skyline of tar and gravel, metal and glass. But every surface was empty. There were no open access doors, no figures silhouetted against the sky. He was alone, utterly, undeniably alone on his 5-story high track. Shaking his head, he started running again, a little faster this time, a nervous energy fueling his strides. Almost immediately, the tapping resumed from directly overhead, matching his new, quicker tempo with infuriating precision. It was closer now, no longer a faint echo but a crisp, clear sound, as if the source were just on the other side of the low parapet wall, or on the roof of the single-story amenities building that the track curved around. His heart began to beat a frantic counter-rhythm to the steps. This was no acoustic quirk. This was pursuit. An unseen, overhead pursuer was tracking his every move, its presence announced only by the sound of its footsteps, a ghostly jogger keeping pace from the skies. He ran on, his sanctuary now feeling like a stage, his every step broadcast to an invisible, attentive audience whose own footsteps were growing steadily, terrifyingly, louder. The footsteps from above were no longer a distant echo. They were a percussive hammering directly overhead, a frantic, syncopated beat that drowned out the sound of his own frantic breathing and the slap of his trainers on the track. It was as if his unseen pursuer had abandoned all stealth and was now sprinting flat out across the rooftops, its pace a manic, desperate mirror of his own terror-fueled flight. The sound was everywhere, bouncing off the glass and concrete canyon, disorienting him, making it impossible to pinpoint a single source. It was above, it was behind, it was to the left, a sonic cage closing in. Jake's world had shrunk to the rubberized path and the ominous ceiling of sound pressing down on him. His lungs burned and a stitch clawed at his side, but he didn't dare slow down. The rational part of his mind had short-circuited, leaving only the primal, lizard-brain imperative to run. He rounded a sharp bend, the track skirting the edge of the amenities block, a single-story structure with a flat, gravel-covered roof. The footsteps from directly above were so loud now, they seemed to be vibrating through the very structure, a thunderous stampede just out of sight. Then it happened. From over the edge of the amenities block roof, something fell. It wasn't dropped, it was placed, with a deliberate, almost gentle motion, landing directly in the center of the track, a mere 10 feet in front of him. It was a shoe, an old, weathered man's dress shoe, scuffed and cracked, its sole worn thin, its laces frayed and grey with age. It landed with a soft, final thud on the synthetic turf, lying perfectly upright, as if waiting for its owner to step into it. The thunderous overhead footsteps ceased. The silence was instantaneous and absolute, more deafening than the cacophony that had preceded it. It was a vacuum, a sudden, shocking void where the pounding rhythm had been. Jake skidded to a halt, his body trembling, his eyes locked on the solitary, decrepit shoe. His heart hammered against his ribs, a wild, frantic drum in the profound stillness. He stared at it, his mind reeling, trying to process the impossible symbolism of the object. He looked up, his gaze scanning the roofline of the amenities block, the taller buildings beyond. There was nothing. No movement, no shadow, no hint of a presence. The rooftops were as empty and silent as they had been at the start of his run. The pursuit was over. He didn't wait to see if it would start again. He didn't approach the shoe. He gave it a wide, terrified berth, his eyes fixed on it until he was past. Then he broke into a final, desperate sprint for the access door at the far end of the track. He didn't look back. He burst through the door, stumbling down the concrete stairs, the familiar, enclosed space feeling like a sanctuary after the exposed horror of the track. He didn't stop until he was on the solid, reassuring pavement of the street below, surrounded by the normal, oblivious flow of evening pedestrians. He never went back to Rooftop Run. The memory of the pounding footsteps and the chilling finality of that single, dropped shoe was a stain on his mind that no amount of city noise could erase. Weeks later, the incident still gnawing at him, he mentioned it in a hushed tone to an old-timer who ran a newsstand near his flat. He didn't give details, just asked if there were any strange stories about the high-level track. The old man had nodded slowly, his eyes distant. "Aye," he'd said, polishing a grimy counter with a rag. "Heard a tale, long time ago, before they built all that fancy stuff up there. Fella, a shoemaker, lost his business, his family, everything. They say he jumped from one of the old buildings they cleared for that development. Never found one of his shoes." The man had shrugged, as if dismissing a trivial piece of city folklore. "Just a rumor, son, just a jumper from decades past." But for Jake, it was the final, horrifying piece of the puzzle. The overhead pursuer hadn't been chasing him. It had been reenacting its final, desperate run. The syncopated footsteps were the sound of a man running towards the edge of his world. And the shoe, that lonely, weathered object, was the only thing he had left behind, a ghostly token dropped from a life already ended, a final, unanswered question left on the track for whoever was unlucky enough to be running below. There is a peculiar magic to old glass, a way it can trap light and memory within its silvered depths, holding moments captive long after the world has moved on. For Claire, a postgraduate student of history walking the cobbled length of Mirror Street in Oxford, that magic was about to become terrifyingly real. The street was a preserved relic, a canyon of honey-colored Cotswold stone where the shopfront still bore painted signs and the windows were made of wavering hand-blown glass. It was a place that actively resisted the present, a fact she usually found charming. Today, the low afternoon sun cast long, distorted shadows, and the countless window panes glowed like sheets of liquid gold, each one a potential portal. She was admiring the display in an antiquarian bookshop, her own reflection a ghostly superimposition over a collection of leather-bound atlases, when the reflection shifted. For a fraction of a second, the image of her modern jacket and jeans was replaced by the bustle and high collar of a dark wool dress. A woman in Victorian attire stood where her reflection should have been, her head bent as if examining a book that wasn't there. Claire blinked, and the image was gone, replaced once more by her own startled face. She let out a small, shaky laugh. A historical exhibit, she told herself, a clever projection or a trick of the light, designed to amuse tourists and enhance the street's old-world ambience. It was impressive, the way it had been seamlessly integrated into the glass. She walked on, her curiosity piqued. The next window belonged to a haberdashery, its shelves stacked with ribbons and bolts of cloth. Again, her reflection flickered. This time, a man in a stiff, formal suit and a top hat was speaking with the shopkeeper, his gestures animated, his mouth moving in silent conversation. The scene was vibrant, detailed, the dust motes dancing in a sunbeam that came from within the reflection itself. It lasted for 3 full seconds before dissolving back into the mundane reality of empty spools and her own wide-eyed stare. Her initial amusement began to curdle into a low thrum of unease. This was no projection. The technology didn't exist to create such perfect interactive scenes in the imperfections of antique glass. The people moved with a natural, unscripted grace, their clothing showing the subtle wear of real life, their expressions full of unstaged emotion. A strange magnetic pull began to emanate from the windows, a silent siren call that tugged at the edges of her consciousness. It was no longer a spectacle to be observed, but an invitation. The third window, a baker's, showed a scene of frantic activity. A flour-dusted boy kneaded dough on a wooden table, while a woman in a long apron pulled steaming loaves from a vast black oven. The heat from the ovens seemed to radiate from the glass, a phantom warmth that brushed against her face. She could almost smell the yeast and the burning wood. The pull intensified, a physical sensation in her chest, as if a hook had been set deep within her and was slowly, inexorably, reeling her in towards the silvered surface. The rational part of her mind, the part that dealt in dates and documents, screamed that this was impossible, a dangerous delusion. But the older, more instinctual part was captivated, yearning to step through the veil of time and into the bustling, vivid world held prisoner in the glass. She stood transfixed, a modern woman caught in the gravitational pull of the past, the line between observer and participant blurring with every silent, beckoning scene. The pull from the baker's window was a physical force, a current in the air that seemed to thin the barrier between now and then. Claire's reflection had vanished completely, replaced by the bustling Victorian scene. The flour-dusted boy looked up from his dough, his eyes, clear and startlingly blue, scanning the shop, and then they locked directly onto hers. It was not the vacant gaze of a recorded image or a clever projection. It was a look of genuine, startled curiosity, the look of one person seeing another across a room. He nudged the woman at the oven, who turned, her hands covered in flour, her expression shifting from concentration to mild surprise. They were not looking at a window, they were looking through it, and they were looking at her. A cold dread, entirely separate from the phantom heat of the ovens, washed over Claire. This was no passive display. This was an interface. Before she could process the terrifying implications, the woman at the oven did something that stopped the breath in Claire's lungs. She smiled, a small tentative curve of her lips, and then, slowly and deliberately, she raised one flower-white hand and waved. It was a gentle, beckoning gesture, an invitation to step out of the cold street and into the warmth of her shop, a shop that had not existed for over a century. The hook in Claire's chest gave a violent final tug. Her own hand, as if belonging to someone else, lifted from her side. Compelled by a force older than reason, she reached out, her fingers stretching toward the wavering glass of the window pane. She expected to feel the cool, hard resistance of the surface. Instead, her fingertips met a strange, yielding pressure, like pushing through a membrane of thick, warm water. The moment her skin made contact, the world dissolved. The sounds of modern Oxford, the distant purr of a car, the chatter of students, were ripped away, replaced by the clatter of hooves on cobbles, the raucous cries of street vendors, and the dense, complex smell of horse manure, coal smoke, and baking bread. The visual world swirled, the honey-colored stone of the buildings seeming to pulse and breathe, the light shifting to the thicker golden hue of gaslight. She felt a terrible vertiginous lurch, as if the street itself were tilting, pouring her forward into the past. She was not just seeing the reflection, she was being pulled into it, her body feeling insubstantial, her very identity beginning to fray at the edges, ready to be rewoven into the fabric of a long-dead afternoon. A scream, silent and internal, tore through the core of her being. This was not a journey, it was an erasure, the part of her that was Claire, with her thesis deadlines and her flat share and her life, fought back with a surge of pure primal terror. She planted her feet on the cobbles, her muscles straining against the inexorable drag. She wrenched her arm back, the sensation like pulling it from thick, setting glue. With a final desperate heave, she broke the contact. The spectral sounds and smells vanished, the world snapping back into focus with a jarring, silent finality. She stood gasping on the pavement, her heart trying to beat its way out of her chest, her outstretched hand trembling violently. The window was just a window again, showing only the dark, empty interior of a closed baker's shop and her own pale, terrified reflection. She did not wait to see if the woman would wave again. She turned and ran. She ran from Mirror Street as if the hounds of hell were at her heels, her feet slipping on the ancient cobbles, her breath sobbing in her throat. She did not stop until she was deep in the neon-lit heart of the modern city, surrounded by the comforting, mundane glare of chain stores and the roar of traffic. The next day, the fear still a cold stone in her gut, she went to the Bodleian Library. She spent hours in the local history section, her hands still unsteady as she turned the pages of heavy, leather-bound archives. She found Mirror Street easily. It had not always been a quiet, preserved lane for tourists. In the mid-19th century, it had been the city's primary market street, a teeming, chaotic and vibrant thoroughfare, a hub of commerce and community life. The very same shops whose windows now held silent, terrifying portals had once been the bustling heart of the city. The article she read described it in vivid detail. The baker, the haberdasher, the bookseller, all named, all real people who had lived and worked and died on that street. The past wasn't just being reflected, it was preserved there, intact and waiting, a fly trapped in the amber of the old glass, desperate to draw in fresh life to maintain its vivid, ghostly reality. Claire never walked down Mirror Street again. She took lengthy, inconvenient detours to avoid even catching a glimpse of its honey-colored stones. But sometimes, on evenings when the light was just right, she would find herself staring at her own reflection in a modern window, her heart lurching with a residual panic, half expecting to see the image shift, for a hand from another time to rise and beckon her back towards the silent, waiting market street that existed just behind the silvered surface of the past. There is a certain quality of sunlight that does not illuminate but liberates. On Shade Road in Brighton, on those rare, brilliantly sunny days when the coast shed its customary veil of sea fret, the light did not simply fall, it performed. It poured between the tall Regency townhouses, carving the pavement into stark geometries of brilliance and umbra. And in that sharp, clean division, the shadows stirred. They were not mere absences of light, not passive silhouettes cast by lampposts and wrought-iron fences. They were entities in their own right, detaching from their sources with a fluid, silent grace to dance their own secret, silent ballet on the warm stone. Linda saw it first from the corner of her eye, a flicker of movement where none should be. A long, slender shadow cast by a slender birch tree was not lying placidly on the ground. It was undulating, its form rippling like a black ribbon in a non-existent breeze, its tip tracing elegant, complex patterns on the sun-bleached pavement. She stopped, her shopping bags momentarily forgotten, and stared. The rational part of her mind scrambled for an explanation, a trick of heat haze, a quirk of her own vision. But the air was cool and clear, and the movement was too deliberate, too choreographed. As she watched, the shadow of a cast-iron bench peeled itself away from its solid counterpart and performed a slow, ponderous pirouette before settling a foot to the left of where physics dictated it should be. A nervous laugh escaped her lips, the sound small and brittle in the uncanny silence of the street. She looked around, expecting to see other pedestrians staring, pointing, sharing in her disbelief. But the few people on Shade Road walked with averted eyes and a hurried pace, their own shadows clinging dutifully to their heels as if afraid to misbehave. They knew, the locals knew, and they had long ago learned not to watch the performance. Her own shadow, a stretched dark version of herself, lay obediently at her feet. For now, driven by a compulsion she didn't understand, she took a step forward. Her shadow moved with her, a perfect mimic. She took another, then a third, and then, on the fourth step, it hesitated. It was a fractional lag, a stutter in the seamless connection between body and shade. On the fifth step, it didn't follow at all. It remained behind, a lone dark cutout of herself standing independently on the pavement. Then it moved. It took a step of its own, not in parallel with her, but at a right angle, gliding smoothly toward the mouth of a narrow, brick-lined alley that plunged into deep shadow between two houses. A cold thrill, a mixture of terror and irresistible curiosity, shot through her. This was no longer a spectacle to be observed from a distance. It was a personal summons. Her shadow, her own dark echo, was leading her. It paused at the alley's entrance, a two-dimensional silhouette against the bright street, and seemed to turn its featureless head back toward her. A silent question. Then it slipped into the darkness of the passage. Without another thought, her rational mind utterly subsumed by the need to follow, to reclaim the part of herself that had walked away, Linda stepped into the alley. The transition was like diving into cold water. The brilliant sunlight of Shade Road vanished, replaced by a dank, chill gloom. The sounds of the city faded to a distant murmur. She could just make out the form of her shadow ahead, a deeper blackness in the already dark passage, moving with a confident, flowing gait. It led her deeper, around a slight bend, to a dead end where a high brick wall was covered in a shaggy coat of ivy. Here, in the deepest pool of shadow, her shadow stopped. It stood perfectly still for a moment, facing the wall, and then, with a final fluid motion, it flowed back across the ground and snapped back onto her feet, reattaching itself to her with a sensation that was both physical and psychic, a soft, cold click that she felt in her bones and her soul simultaneously. The world swam. A wave of profound disorientation washed over her, so potent she had to lean against the damp, cold brick to keep from falling. It was a vertigo of the spirit. For a few seconds, she couldn't remember which way she had come, why she was there, or even who she was. The memory of the dancing, shadows, and her own independent shade felt like a dream, vivid yet impossibly distant. The alley was just an alley, dark and unremarkable. Shaking her head to clear the fog, she stumbled back out onto Shade Road, the sunlight now feeling harsh and accusing. Blinking in the brightness, she noticed an old man tending a tiny, overgrown front garden a few doors down. He was watching her, his expression a mixture of pity and knowing resignation. Feeling foolish and exposed, she approached him, her words tumbling out in a confused jumble about shadows and alleys, and feeling lost. The old man listened, nodding slowly, his gnarled hands pausing their work among the forget-me-nots. "Aye," he said, his voice a soft rasp like waves on shingle. "You met her then? Serafina. Dancer she was. A famous one, back in her day. Loved this street, said the light here was perfect. Died in a fire, poor soul, a century ago. They say her spirit never left. On sunny days she borrows the shadows, makes them dance like she used to. Sometimes, if she takes a liking to you, she'll borrow your own just for a moment, just to remember what it was like to have a body to move. He gave her a sad smile. Don't you worry, she always gives 'em back. The explanation did not lessen the deep, unsettled feeling in the core of her being. She thanked the man and walked away, her shopping bags heavy in her hands. She never walked down Shade Road on a sunny day again, preferring the longer, shadier routes. But sometimes, on bright afternoons, she would catch her shadow stretching long behind her, and she would watch it with a wary eye, half expecting it to pause, to turn its head, and to once again dance away without her, a permanent guest in the silent, sunlit ballroom of a ghost. There is a special kind of loneliness that thrives in the narrow, forgotten arteries of a city, a solitude that does not whisper but calls out, seeking recognition in the dark. For Ben, a new tenant in a cramped flat overlooking the cobbled canyon of Pipe Alley in Cardiff, that loneliness had a voice. It began on his third night, as he unpacked boxes in the dim yellow light of his single room. A sound, faint at first, threaded its way through the damp night air and the thin glass of his window. It was not the hum of distant traffic or the murmur of a television next door. It was a voice, clear and distinct, calling a name: Eleanor. The sound seemed to emanate not from a door or a window, but from the very walls of the alley, as if the aged brickwork and the cast-iron drainpipes themselves had learned to speak. He paused, a stack of books heavy in his arms, and listened. The call did not come again. He dismissed it as a neighbor, a lost tourist, a trick of the wind funneled through the tight space. But the next evening, as he returned from work, the voice returned. Thomas. It was closer this time, seeming to issue from a large rust-scabbed drain pipe that ran down the building opposite his own. The tone was neither friendly nor threatening, but flat and repetitive, like a recording played on a loop, yet it carried an undeniable plaintive weight. He stopped on the pavement, his keys cold in his hand, and peered into the deep shadows of the alley. It was empty, a tunnel of darkness bookended by the distant, misty glow of streetlights. The calls became a nightly fixture, a part of the alley's soundscape, as regular as the dripping of water from a broken gutter. Sarah, William, Margaret. They were always different names, spoken in that same neutral echoing tone. They never called for Ben, and for that he was perversely grateful, yet the exclusion made him feel like an outsider eavesdropping on a private, endless roll call of the lost. His curiosity, a stubborn flame, began to burn brighter than his unease. He had to find the source. He had to see the mouth that formed those names. One rain-swept night, the call was Arthur, and it seemed to come from just around the next bend in the alley. The compulsion was irresistible. Pulling his coat tight against the chill, he left the weak sanctuary of his doorway and stepped into the alley proper. The cobbles were slick and uneven underfoot, the high walls on either side seeming to lean in, their wet surfaces gleaming in the faint light from his phone. He followed the voice, his footsteps echoing in the confined space. "Arthur," it called again, closer now, seeming to emanate from a cluster of pipes where two buildings met. He moved toward it, his heart a steady, anxious drum. The voice led him on, a spectral guide through the twisting lane. It would call from a pipe ahead. Then, as he approached, the next call would sound from further on, around another corner. He was being led deeper, away from the main road, into a part of the alley he had never explored, a cul-de-sac where the buildings pressed so close together they nearly touched overhead, creating a tunnel of absolute blackness. The final call, Arthur, came from directly ahead, from the dead end itself. He stood before a blank, windowless wall, slick with moss and damp. A single, large drainage pipe, thick as a tree trunk, was bolted to the brickwork, its open mouth a dark circle in the gloom. He stood there, waiting, the rain pattering on his shoulders. The alley was silent now, holding its breath. He took a step closer to the pipe, leaning in, expecting to hear the whisper again, to perhaps see some glimmer of light or movement in the dark orifice. Instead, a new sound erupted from the pipe. It was a laugh, a dry, rasping, profoundly joyless sound that contained no mirth, only a cold, ancient mockery. It was the sound of a trap being sprung, of a joke finally understood at the victim's expense. The laugh echoed in the confined space, seeming to come from all around him, from every pipe and every wet brick, before it faded into the dripping silence. A cold dread, colder than the rain, seized him. He stumbled backward, his earlier curiosity incinerated by the sheer, mocking malice of that sound. He turned and fled, his flight a frantic, slipping scramble back the way he had come. He did not stop until he was back in his flat, the door locked and bolted behind him. But the laugh echoed in his mind, a stain he could not wipe clean. Sleep was impossible. As dawn's grey light filtered through the grimy window, a new grim resolve took hold. He had to know. He had to understand what he had stumbled into. He waited for full daylight before venturing back into the alley, his purpose now one of investigation, not pursuit. The dead end looked mundane in the flat, colourless morning light, just a damp, forgotten corner of the city. It was then he noticed it, partly hidden behind an overflowing waste bin, a small recessed doorway long since bricked up. Tucked into a gap in the crumbling mortar was a bundle of something, wrapped in a disintegrating plastic bag. His hands trembled as he pulled it free. Inside were newspapers, their paper brittle and yellowed, the print faded. He took them back to his flat and spread them out on the floor. They were local editions from the 1950s. The headlines were all variations on the same grim theme. Local boy vanishes on errand. Second child missing in a month. Police baffled by disappearances. The articles were brief, the language restrained, but the horror was palpable. The children had all last been seen playing in or near Pipe Alley. The final article, dated nearly a year after the first, was the shortest. It stated that the official investigation had been scaled down due to a lack of leads. No bodies were ever found. No one was ever charged. Ben sat on the floor amidst the crumbling history, the pieces clicking into place with a terrible final logic. The echoing calls were not random. They were a memorial, a ghostly roll call of the lost, repeated for decades by whatever presence lingered in the pipes and the stones. The laughter was the entity's triumph, its cruel punchline for anyone foolish enough to follow the trail to its end. He was not just haunted by the discovery, he was poisoned by it. The knowledge that he slept just yards from where children had vanished without a trace, that their names were still called into the night by a mocking, unseen force, made the walls of his flat feel like those of a tomb. He moved out the following week, giving no explanation to the landlord beyond a terse personal reasons. He left Cardiff altogether, but he could not leave the memory behind. The image of the yellowed newspapers and the sound of that dry, rasping laugh followed him, a permanent passenger in his mind. He was haunted not by a ghost, but by the chilling, unsolved truth of Pipe Alley and the terrible echoing calls that ensured the lost would never, ever be forgotten. There is a terror that lies not in the monstrous or the spectral, but in the perfect, seamless replication of the mundane. For David, a surveyor visiting Leeds on a grey, drizzly Tuesday, that terror was woven into the very fabric of Circle End. The street was a perfect, unbroken loop of post-war semis, a neat, sterile crescent where nothing was out of place and everything was exactly the same. The same car, a blue Ford Focus, was parked in the same driveway. The same net curtains hung in the same windows. The same elderly man in a brown cardigan was watering the same patch of lawn, his movements slow and methodical, a study in suburban predictability. It was a place so ordinary it felt anesthetized, a stage set waiting for its actors to take their marks. David, there to assess a property for a potential client, felt the oppressive weight of its uniformity the moment he stepped out of his car. The first hour passed without incident. He took his measurements, made his notes, the drizzle of fine, cold mist against his face. He watched the man in the cardigan finish his watering, coil the hose with the same precise loops, and disappear inside his identical house. A woman in a pink anorak walked a yapping terrier, the dog straining at the same point on the same lamppost. David finished his work, packed his equipment into his car, and prepared to leave. As he turned the key in the ignition, he glanced at his watch. It was 3:07 p.m. He looked up, his eyes scanning the street one last time. The man in the brown cardigan was back outside, uncoiling the green hose with the same slow, deliberate motions. The woman in the pink anorak was walking her terrier again, the dog pulling toward the same lamppost. The scene was identical, not similar, identical. The angle of the man's body, the pattern of the dog's barks, the position of a specific cloud in the grey sky above. It was a perfect, chilling rerun. A cold knot tightened in David's stomach. He looked at his watch again. 3:08 p.m. He had been sitting in his car for over a minute, yet the scene had reset, as if no time had passed at all. He switched off the engine, his heart beginning to beat a little faster. He watched, a captive audience to the street's private performance. The man watered, coiled the hose, went inside. The woman walked, the dog yapped, they turned the corner. The blue Ford Focus did not move. Nothing changed. The drizzle fell at the same rate. He waited, his breath fogging the window, his eyes fixed on the stage of Circle End. At precisely 4:07 p.m., the performance began again. The man emerged with his hose, the woman appeared with her dog. The same actions, the same timing, the same suffocating sameness. The street was stuck, a record skipping in a groove, replaying the same hour of its life for an eternity. This was no coincidence, no collective eccentricity. This was a prison. A temporal anomaly had sealed Circle End in a perfect one-hour loop, and its residents, trapped within the cycle, were blissfully, terrifyingly unaware. They were ghosts in a machine, performing their parts without memory or deviation. David, an outsider, was the only one who could see the bars of the cage. A desperate scientific curiosity warred with his rising panic. He had to test it. He had to introduce a variable to see if the loop could be broken. He got out of his car, the drizzle immediately soaking his hair. He walked to a green municipal trash can positioned at the curb a few houses down. It was part of the set, emptied at the same time in every loop, he was sure. He gripped its cold, wet plastic and dragged it 10 feet down the pavement, positioning it squarely in front of the blue Ford's driveway. The act felt both profoundly foolish and monumentally significant. He was defacing a perfect painting, introducing a flaw into a flawless system. He returned to his car, his heart hammering, and waited. The hour played out its familiar script. The man watered his lawn, the woman walked her dog. At 4:07 p.m., the reset began. David held his breath, his eyes locked on the trash can. For a single, heart-stopping second, it remained in its new position. Then, with a soft, almost imperceptible shimmer in the air, like heat haze on a summer road, it was back. It snapped back to its original spot at the curb, as if it had never been moved. The flaw had been corrected. The system had rejected his change. The loop was immutable, its integrity defended by forces he could not see or comprehend. The finality of it was a cold wave that washed over him. There was no fighting this. There was no altering it. Circle End was a closed system, a pocket of time divorced from the forward flow of the universe, and he was an contaminant that needed to be expelled. The urge to leave, to escape the silent, screaming horror of the endless hour, was overwhelming. He started the car, the engine's roar of violent intrusion in the quiet street. He didn't look at the man with the hose, or the woman with the dog. He didn't look back. He drove, his tires hissing on the wet tarmac, following the curve of the crescent until it spat him out at the entrance, back onto a normal road where time moved forward in its messy, unpredictable way. He glanced in his rearview mirror once. Circle End lay behind him, serene and perfect, a tranquil temporal trap for its unsuspecting residents, its secret safe, its hourly repeat destined to continue, unnoticed and unbroken, forever. There is a particular kind of chill that has nothing to do with the weather, a cold that seems to emanate from a place outside of time itself. For Lisa, driving home from a long day's work in Newcastle, that chill was waiting on the river bridge. The bridge was a hulking, iron-girded leviathan spanning the dark, swift-moving Tyne, its streetlights casting frail, trembling reflections on the water's inky surface. The night was clear and sharp, the city lights a glittering diadem in the distance. But the bridge itself felt isolated, a metal spine connecting two worlds, one of which was not entirely of the living. Her headlights swept across the pedestrian walkway, and there, standing beneath one of the flickering lamps, was a figure. It was a young man, perhaps in his early 20s, dressed in clothes that seemed just slightly out of date. A denim jacket, faded jeans, scuffed trainers. He held his thumb out in the universal gesture of the hitchhiker, his posture slumped with a weariness that was palpable even from a distance. But it was his face that held her attention. It was not just pale, it was bloodless, a mask of waxy white, and his eyes were dark, hollow pits that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. A normal person would have driven on, a prickle of unease urging them to ignore the lone figure on the dark bridge. But Lisa was not a normal person in that moment. She was tired, empathetic, and the sight of such profound dejection stirred a compassion that overrode her caution. She pulled over just past him, the tires crunching on the gritty asphalt of the hard shoulder. The passenger door unlocked with a solid, reassuring clunk. A moment later, it swung open, and the young man slid into the seat beside her. The interior of the car was instantly flooded with a deep, penetrating cold, as if an iceberg had just been placed in the passenger footwell. The warmth from the heater vanished, swallowed by this new Arctic presence. The scent of the car, of old coffee and the pine tree air freshener, was replaced by the faint, metallic odor of river water and wet stone. "Thanks," the hitcher said, his voice a dry, papery rustle, like leaves skittering across pavement. He didn't look at her, his hollow gaze fixed on the road ahead. Lisa pulled back into the lane, the car feeling heavier, slower, as if burdened by its new occupant's profound mass of sorrow. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable, broken only by the hum of the engine and the whisper of the tires on the bridge deck. Then he spoke again, his tone flat and devoid of emotion, as if reciting a story he had told 1,000 times. It was a night like this, clear, cold. He gestured vaguely with a pale hand toward the windscreen. "I was in a hurry, a girl, a date. I'd borrowed my dad's car." He paused, and the cold in the car seemed to intensify, frosting the edges of the windshield. A lorry, its tire blue, came right across the lane. There was nowhere to go. Lisa's knuckles were white on the steering wheel. She dared a glance at him. He was still staring ahead, but now a single glistening track of moisture, cold as melted frost, traced a path down his marble cheek. "We went through the barrier," he whispered, the sound barely audible over the engine. "Right here. It gave way so easily, like it was made of paper." He turned his head slowly, and his dark eyes finally met hers. In their depths, she saw a flicker of the terror he must have felt in his final moments. The shriek of tearing metal, the dizzying, weightless fall, the shocking final embrace of the black, icy water. It was so dark down there, and so cold. His story ended as abruptly as it had begun. He faced forward again, the single tear now frozen on his skin. Lisa was trembling, her breath pluming in the frozen air of the car. She wanted to speak, to offer some word of comfort, but her throat was locked tight with a fear and a pity so immense they had no sound. They reached the end of the bridge. The tires thumped over the join where the bridge deck met the solid ground of the far bank. Lisa slowed, preparing to ask where he needed to be dropped, her mind already racing with the logistics of this impossible situation. But when she looked at the passenger seat, it was empty. The young man was gone. He had not opened the door. He had not made a sound. One moment he was there, a solid, cold presence beside her, and the next he had simply ceased to exist. The deep, unnatural cold began to recede, but it left a residue, a pocket of winter that clung stubbornly to the passenger seat and the air around it. Lisa pulled over again, her entire body shaking, and stared at the vacant space. The seatbelt was still clipped into its holder. The scent of river water lingered. She drove home in a daze, the phantom story echoing in her mind. For days afterward, her car was haunted by the encounter. No matter how high she cranked the heater, a persistent, localized cold spot remained in the passenger seat, a chill that no amount of sunshine could ever truly warm. It was a cold that seeped into the very fabric of the upholstery, a permanent souvenir from a passenger who had finished his journey decades ago, a ghostly hitchhiker forever trying to get to the other side of the river, forever recounting the tale of the crash that had trapped him on the bridge for all eternity. There is a particular kind of solitude found in the deep, rural lanes of Devon, a silence so profound it feels like a presence itself. For Tom, a landscape photographer seeking the raw beauty of the countryside after a night of soft rain, that solitude was both a gift and a curse on Mud Path. The lane was little more than a dirt track, hemmed in by towering, dripping hedgerows, its surface a churned-up morass of thick, chocolate-brown mud. It was a place forgotten by tarmac and traffic, a relic of a older, slower England. The air was heavy with the rich, earthy scent of wet soil and decaying leaves, and the only sound was the squelch of his own Wellington boots and the distant, mournful cry of a crow. He walked with his camera held ready, his eyes searching for the perfect composition in the play of light on waterlogged furrows and the jewel-like droplets clinging to spider webs. It was the footprints that broke the spell. He noticed them 20 yards ahead, a fresh set of impressions punched deep into the soft mud. They were the clear, sharp marks of a walking boot, similar in size and tread to his own. He paused, a flicker of annoyance mingling with curiosity. He had assumed he was alone out here. He scanned the lane ahead, but it stretched empty, curving away into the green tunnel of the hedgerows. There was no one in sight. Shrugging, he continued, his own boots sinking into the mire with a wet, sucking sound. He kept his eyes on the mysterious prints, noting how they followed the center of the path, just as his did. And then, the cold, impossible truth began to dawn on him. The footprints were not just similar to his, they were matching his pace. With every step he took, a new print appeared in the mud, precisely where his own foot was about to fall, as if an invisible walker were preceding him by a fraction of a second, a phantom echo laying down a path for him to follow. A jolt of primal disbelief shot through him. He stopped dead, his heart lurching against his ribs. The moment his foot stilled, the creation of new prints ceased. The lane ahead showed only the existing trail, leading ominously around the bend. A slow, creeping dread began to frost its way up his spine. He took a single, hesitant step forward. A new print appeared, exactly 1 pace ahead. He took another. Another print materialized. It was a perfect, horrifying synchronization. He was not following tracks. He was being led, his own footsteps being preempted by an unseen presence that walked the path, just inches in front of him, its passage marked only by the depressions it left in the earth. The squelch of his own boots was the only sound, yet he felt the weight of another's passage, the displacement of air, the ghost of a footfall that never made a noise. Panic, cold and sharp, began to crystallize in his chest. This was wrong. This was a violation of reality. He spun around, his decision made. He would go back. He would abandon the chute and get off this cursed path. He took a firm step back the way he had come, his eyes fixed on the mud where his own prints were deepest. And as he moved, he watched. No new prints appeared ahead of him on the return journey. The unseen walker had stopped. It did not follow him. It only led. It only walked forward. The path behind him was just a path, marked only by his own lonely, retreating footsteps. The entity, whatever it was, remained up ahead, waiting around the bend, its purpose bound to the forward direction of the lane. He did not run. A superstitious fear held him, a conviction. That to run would be to acknowledge the chase, to invite pursuit. He walked, his pace quick and tense, back to the safety of the gravel lane where he had parked his car. He didn't look back. Once inside the metal shell of his vehicle, the engine's roar a blessed affirmation of the normal world, he allowed the trembling to take hold. Later, in the warm, beery haze of the local pub, he mentioned the incident in a hushed, embarrassed tone to the landlord, a man born and bred in the area. The man's jovial expression sobered instantly. "Aye," he said, wiping a glass with a slow, deliberate motion. "The walker of Mud Path. You saw its tracks then. Story goes, a farmhand got lost in a blizzard on that path 100 years ago. They found his body in the spring, but they say his soul never made it home. Still walks the path trying to find his way back. But he only knows one direction. He just walks, unseen, forever leading folks onward. Most around here know to avoid it after dark or after a rain. The tale, spoken with the weight of local law, confirmed the horror. Tom never returned to Mud Path, the memory of those self-creating footprints a permanent reminder that some paths are walked not just by the living, but by the lost, forever retracing their final lonely journey in the mud. There is a weight to history, a gravity that seems to settle in stone and bronze, holding the past in a firm, unyielding grasp. In London's Monument Square, that weight was not a constant. The square was a pantheon of the city's forgotten greats, a collection of stern-faced generals, thoughtful poets, and benevolent philanthropists, all frozen in dramatic poses atop granite plinths. By day, it was a place for tourists to eat their lunches and pigeons to hold court, the statues standing as immutable as the laws of physics. But Gary, the night watchman whose small, brightly lit booth was the square's only after-hours sentinel, knew a different truth. He knew that when the city slept and the moon washed the cobbles in silver, the laws governing Monument Square became flexible. It began with small discrepancies, things a less meticulous man would have attributed to fatigue or faulty memory. The stern General Havisham, who always pointed his bronze sword toward the National Gallery, would be aiming it at the Opera House instead. The poetess Elara Vance, forever caught in the act of dropping a single stone rose, would have her empty hand subtly clenched. Gary noted these changes in his logbook with a growing sense of unease, his rational mind constructing elaborate explanations involving pranksters, sleepwalking, or the city's subtle, imperceptible settling. But the explanations grew thinner with each passing night. The statues weren't just being moved, they were being reposed. Their stony limbs shifted with a subtlety that spoke of an artist's touch, not a vandal's brute force. The pivotal night was moonless and still, the air so quiet Gary could hear the hum of the distant streetlights as a tangible sound. He was on his third round, the beam of his torch cutting a familiar path across the cobbles. He stopped, as he always did, before the central statue of Lord Pendleton, the square's founder, who stood with one hand resting on a marble globe. Except tonight, Lord Pendleton's hand was not on the globe. It was raised, palm outward, as if in a gesture of warning or warding. A cold trickle of apprehension traced its way down Gary's spine. This was no subtle shift, this was a fundamental change in the statue's narrative. He swung his torch beam across the square, and the breath caught in his throat. They had all moved, not just one or two, but all of them. The generals had turned their backs on their plinths, their swords now pointing inward toward the center of the square. The poets and philanthropists had descended from their pedestals, their bronze feet planted firmly on the cobbles. They stood in a loose, silent circle, their blank stone eyes no longer, gazing at some distant horizon, but focused on a single, empty point in the very heart of the square. The air grew thick and cold, the familiar hum of the city vanishing, replaced by a profound listening silence that seemed to emanate from the statues themselves. Gary stood frozen in the center of their circle, his torch beam shaking, illuminating one impassive stony face after another. They were not looking at him, not yet, but he was trapped within the perimeter of their attention. A soft, grinding sound, like millstones turning deep underground, began to vibrate through the soles of his boots. As one, the statues took a single, synchronized step forward. The circle tightened, the grinding ceased, and the silence returned, heavier than before. They were closer now, their massive forms looming over him, their shadows merging into a single pool of darkness that swallowed his own. He could see the intricate details of their carved uniforms, the folds in their bronze cloaks, the faint green patina of age on their cheeks. The air was so cold his breath plumed in thick, frantic clouds. He was about to scream, to run, to do anything to break the terrifying tableau, when the movement reversed. With the same silent, seamless grace, the statues stepped back. Then they turned, their heavy forms moving with an impossible, weightless fluidity, and ascended their plinths. Limbs repositioned, heads tilted back to their original angles, props were reclaimed. In less than a minute, the square was restored to its daytime arrangement. General Havisham pointed his sword at the gallery. Elara Vance's hand was open, waiting for a rose that would never fall. Lord Pendleton's palm was once again resting on his marble globe. The normal sounds of the night rushed back in, a distant siren, the rustle of a fox in the bushes, as if a mute button had been released. Gary stood trembling in the suddenly ordinary square, his logbook and torch lying forgotten at his feet. The encounter had not been threatening, not in any active sense. It had been a display, a silent, coordinated performance for an audience of one. He had not been harmed, but he had been seen, acknowledged by the stone, and the knowledge of that attention was a chill that would never leave his bones. He did not finish his shift. He walked back to his booth, collected his coat, and left the keys on the desk. He never returned. His hastily scrawled resignation, citing personal reasons, sparked a brief flurry of gossip, but it was the subsequent night watchmen, none of whom lasted more than a few weeks, who cemented the square's new reputation. They spoke in hushed tones of glimpsed movements in the periphery, of statues found facing the wrong way, of a profound, watchful cold that settled over the square after midnight. Monument Square, once a dignified stop on a historical tour, became known in certain circles for its restless monuments, a place where the stone remembered how to move, and the past was not content to simply stand and be admired.